just to say welcome to the first conference of anti-capitalist resistance. We're a new organisation. We're made up of a number of different comrades from different traditions. And we've come together in the spirit of unity because I think we're all very aware of, the very serious threats facing us at the moment, from runaway climate change to the growth of fascism and the populist right, and the continuing neoliberal austerity agenda of various governments across the world, which is attacking the working class, and the struggles of the oppressed, which in some countries, as we've seen with Poland around the abortion laws, is actually going backwards. So we want to try and raise ourselves to the tasks facing the socialist left. And we recognise that, being in kind of very small groups, sort of ploughing your own furrow, is not going to be good enough for the coming battles. And we need to try and overcome some of the fracturing on the left. That's not to say there aren't political differences and, there's disagreements and so on, but we want to try and focus on what we can agree on and what we can unite around in a spirit of plurality, to try and build healthy socialist politics, both across this country, as also helping obviously internationally as well. So this is only the first kind of conference of the ACR. If you haven't joined yet, I'd encourage you to do so. We want to try and create a very positive, welcoming environment for socialists. We want to, develop some really good theory, some really good analysis around things. And, as soon as the pandemic is over, obviously we need to, really get out there and be building very positive campaigns around both defensive struggles and trying to, fight for improvements, trying to actually fight to tackle some of the more fundamental issues facing us at the moment. So, I'll kind of finish there, and hopefully we can have a great founding conference and we can go forward in a spirit of unity and collective strength.
Thanks very much, Simon, especially seeing as you had to do that at short notice. So we will now move on to the main business of this morning, which is the discussion on the world crisis and the international revolutionary left. We have three speakers this morning who I will introduce each just before they speak, but we will hear from Phil Hearse, from Cristina Carvalhaes, and from Gilbert Achcar. So Phil is a veteran socialist activist, my notes tell me. I'm not sure I would have used the word veteran, long-standing, I think. He's one of the authors of Creeping Fascism. His articles appear on the Socialist Resistance, International Viewpoint and Mutiny websites, and he's a supporter of anti-capitalist resistance. Over to you, Phil.
Hello, and hello everybody. I think if we were having this discussion 5 or 6 years ago, if you think back what the discussion might have been like, we'd have certainly been discussing austerity. We would have been discussing the climate crisis. We would have been discussing imperialist war, the dreadful aftermath of the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, the dreadful situation in Syria. We'd be talking about political polarization and the growth of the far right. And we'd be talking about probably the aftermath of the Arab Spring and the difficulties in the socialist left. But today, all those things which were kind of common on the left 5 or 6 years ago have recombined in a new and dramatic way into a multi-dimensional crisis in which the key elements interact and have created the biggest crisis in the history of capitalism for certain, or at least since the Second World War, and a real threat to the future of human civilization. And obviously, the two key elements of that, or the three key elements of that, the economic crisis, of course, we always knew that the way they overcame the 2007-2008 crisis by creating a vast pyramid of debt would blow up at some point, but we didn't know how. The climate crisis, the pandemic, which has demonstrated the inequalities and crisis of capitalism in a completely dramatic way. And of course, we've had the experience of the Trump government in the intervening period, which has confirmed the Trump government and its aftermath, in my view, have confirmed what we've said in creeping fascism. We've had a political polarization which has been mainly to the right, but with important elements of fight back from the left, which are referred to. But the one thing which has clearly emerged is that about 8 months ago, Greta Thunberg said, while the pandemic is going on, we shouldn't forget the climate crisis. But successive analysis have demonstrated that the climate crisis and the pandemic are not two separate things. On the contrary, the source of this pandemic, probably, and the source of previous pandemics and the source of future pandemics to come has been industrial agriculture and the destruction of the barriers to forest pathogens which have been unleashed into human populations, and the task of preventing future pandemics is the same thing as the fight for the environment. And at the same time, of course, there have been all kinds of tipping points achieved. And humanity has a very short period of time to prevent a catastrophic slide in global warming. Having said all that, there are important elements of fight back internationally, some of which Simon referred to and I'll come on to in a moment. This crisis is creating a huge social and economic crisis. If they don't suppress the virus, and it looks like neoliberal capitalism will be incapable of suppressing this virus, that putting all their money on vaccines is not going to work, then far greater economic collapse can be expected. And even in this country, they're going to stop shelling out vast amounts of money. They're incapable of doing so. Benefits will be cut. There'll be a massive homeless crisis in the advanced capitalist countries. And already there's a massive crisis in the global south with this pandemic. And the dispute over the vaccine demonstrates that the health systems in the global south have collapsed. The pandemic is now going to sweep through the global south, and as it sweeps through the global south, it will come back to the global north. The inability and the unwillingness of the world capitalism, of the imperialist bourgeoisie, to take measures to aid the people of the global south is creating a further pandemic and eventually economic disaster. The pandemic has demonstrated and illustrated all kinds of divisions and poverty in the global north. We can see that very clearly in Britain itself, that the people who are suffering from this pandemic, the people who are suffering the majority of deaths in this pandemic are the poor. People whose jobs don't keep them at home and they have to go out to work in unsafe workplaces, but it's also especially impacted on women who have borne the brunt of this crisis because they're the main homemakers and because they're the main caregivers. at the local food banks, you can see large numbers of women internationally have left the workforce in a disproportionate numbers during the pandemic because they have to look after their children, to look after older relatives, to be the caregivers and the family organisers. But the polarisation has not just been to the right. But let me say, our view, I think the view of most people in the anti-capitalist resistance, is that although Trump has been defeated, some people responded to that, not in anti-capitalist resistance, but in other left organisations, by saying, you see how stupid the creeping fascism idea was. The events since Trump's defeat on November the 3rd, especially the coup, the semi-coup, fascist coup attempt on January the 6th, has demonstrated that the idea of a continuing push by the extreme right and by fascism was not wrong. And yes, 74 million people voted for Trump, an extraordinary number, and they will continue to organize in the United States and internationally. In the next period, in the elections coming next year in France, the year after in Italy, there is a strong likelihood, for example, that Marine Le Pen and the Rassemblement National will come to power in France, or at least win the presidency. There's a strong likelihood that Salvini will win the presidency, or become the prime minister, sorry, in Italy, a strong possibility. This creeping fascism, this polarization to the right, is a major thing that we have to fight. But on a global scale, there have been extraordinary fightbacks over the last year. The first one to mention, of course, is Black Lives Matter, which has a gigantic international impact, including in this country. In my view, rebounded into the election campaign, mobilizing the black community to defeat Trump. And although as an organization, Black Lives Matter may seem to have gone away, the consciousness of that will recur. But in addition to that, we've seen an extraordinary resurgence of struggle, despite very difficult situations, and a terrible impact of the pandemic amongst people in Latin America, in Bolivia, in Chile, in Argentina, in Ecuador, and other countries, and even the beginnings of a new fight back in Brazil. And I would say that in these struggles, and in the struggles going on today, simultaneously in Tunisia and in Lebanon, you don't necessarily get it on all the news bulletins in Britain, occasionally on Channel 4 News. You have to look further afield for the information. But these fightbacks, this is maybe, Gilbert will say something about this, but the second wave, or the beginnings of a second wave of the Arab Spring. And then there have been the fightbacks of women on the abortion struggles in particular, a very defensive struggle in Poland, but a victorious struggle eventually in Argentina. In all these struggles, you see one thing, and that is the role of young people. To be honest, large numbers of us are not going to be leading the giant mass struggles in the world in the next period. It's going to be young people, and it's going to be women. For example, even in Lebanon, in the Middle East, you see a fantastic, extraordinary mobilization of women, in these young women in these struggles. And this raises, you know, the prospect, the beginnings of, in my opinion, a new wave of feminism. But the new wave of feminism is not these micro business projects in India and all this kind of stuff. The new wave of feminism is young women leading these struggles internationally. But there's a key political kind of theme in all these struggles. They're not just struggles on women's rights, on abortion, or against austerity, but they are struggles for democracy. The political theme of democracy is rising everywhere around the world, from Hong Kong, Poland, Latin America, and we have to be able to integrate that into our politics, because democracy is under threat in this country. Yesterday, people will have seen the appeal court found that these 16 people who were arrested at Stansted Airport, stopping the deportation of so-called illegal immigrants, were wrongly convicted of a terrorism offence. Thank goodness. But the fact that they were charged with a terrorism thing shows the urge, the wish, the attempt by the bourgeoisie internationally to delegitimize and repress struggles, including through legal mechanisms. And some people have called this process the beginnings of a global police state. And it was clear after the Arab Spring, after the Occupy movement in 2007, 2008, the person you saw most often on your television screen on the news at night was the riot policeman. And this, everywhere where protest breaks out, you have the mobilization of riot police, of the army, to try to repress it. The struggle for democracy is a key part of our struggle for a socialist alternative. You have an amazing situation in the United States, in my opinion, where you had simultaneously, you've had 74, 75 million people vote for Donald Trump, but in opinion polls, over the past year, 2 years, 3 years, the number of young people, the number of people in the population as a whole who say that they are more inclined to support socialism than to support capitalism. This is, in some cases, 40%, sometimes 50% or more in these opinion polls. And this represents something really important, the decreasing credibility of this system, the decreasing credibility of this system, and the search for alternatives. But at the same time, unfortunately, we've seen that it's incredibly difficult to build and maintain broad left alternatives which can give a political leadership to the ongoing struggles. And we've seen that, well, and we've seen also, I would say, put it like this, everywhere where a broad left alternatives emerge, which look like they could possibly come to power, possibly provide a governmental alternative, they come under incredible attack from the bourgeoisie. The key example, of course, is what happened to the Corbyn project in Great Britain and the way that that was repressed, but also in a different way, the fantastic mobilization of the elite in the American Democratic Party to defeat Bernie Sanders in two successive presidential election primary campaigns to prevent him from becoming the Democratic candidate, which would be symbolic of the 15. Right, I'll just finish off here, Terry, which would be symbolic of the emergence of the democratic socialists of America. There's no easy formula about how to build a mass alternative to neoliberal capitalism, to creeping fascism, and to the impending catastrophe. Because unless we can make substantial advances on climate change, unless we can throw back the pandemics, humanity faces a giant crisis of human civilization. And we face, in the next period, renewed challenges from the far right, and it means that we have to build left alternatives, of course. But the one thing that the past period has shown is that alternatives which do not have a revolutionary core inspired by Marxism can easily be derailed, and that is the task we have before us in the next period. Okay, Terry, that's it.
Thanks very much, Phil. That's very useful and thought-provoking. I'm very happy to introduce our second speaker today. Cristina Carvalhaes is a journalist and a leader of Insurgencia, a current in the Brazilian PSOL, the Party for Socialism and Freedom. Welcome, Cristina.
Thank you. Good morning. I beg your pardon for my English. We are a very special kind of Latin Americans because we Brazilians don't speak well even the Spanish, and I beg your pardon. I will try to bring here some appointments, some highlights of our draft of a document of international analysis, international situation analysis that the Fourth International Bureau have been preparing for the next international committee next month in February. I think it coincides, it's very similar and complementary to the Phil's comprehension about the complex situation in the world. First of all, everything economical, social, political, everything in the last year have been over determined by the pandemic crisis. Just like Phil commented, this crisis, in our opinion, as we observed in June, had opened a moment of convergence of 3 or 4 long-term phenomena, long-term crises that have been developing in a way relatively autonomous and that are converging now in an explosive way. The ecological crisis, the economic crisis of the capitalism system, the crisis of legitimacy of all the institutions of global governance, whether in the North and in the South, and a geopolitical struggle between the hegemonical US imperialism and new agents, new state agents in the world, just like China and Russia. We think this process are changing substantially, are altering the world that we have been living since the 90s. The situation opened in the 90s of the last century, when the East European bloc and the Soviet Union had her capitalist restoration. we think we live a moment of bifurcation in the path of the history, and it's a major challenge for us and for all the political actors, including the bourgeois actors. In addition to the climate crisis, almost a collapse of the Earth system, we think we are living in very important technological transformations that are threatening the humanity. We are talking about the military technology with a new generation of tactical nuclear weapons and drones and all the gadgets that that make to grow the capacity to decide, to the powers, to decide when and whom to kill. The second technological area is the genetic engineering through the manipulation, appropriation of life, privatization of seeds. That's a part of a global cultural war against peasant life and human food. And third, the appearance of the surveillance capitalism, such as those we have in China with the social credit system. The use of the surveillance systems has been accelerated by the pandemic. Another highlight I would like to remark is the hegemonic transition, or hegemonical crisis, we can say. We are in an increasingly militarized world. The competition between the United States and China is global, and especially in the economic field, and China is recognized as a rising superpower. We think these transformations couldn't develop without very serious conflicts. The threat of a nuclear conflict is reappearing in the world horizon. The third highlight is something that we are talking about as a rising of the neo-fascisms, or rising of a new right. We analyze that there is a major division of political projects in the global bourgeoisie. As a result of the global crisis, an important part of the global bourgeoisie had adopted a fascist project, no? To impose the economic necessities of the system. And we had, I think we need to make deeper this discussion, because it's not only fascism growth, it's an important change in the political paradigm for the bourgeoisie. In this scenario, we think, it's a debate of course, that despite all the factors, the Trump's defeat in the United States was a major setback for the ultra-right project. Of course, it doesn't change the balance of forces in the world, but we are convinced that it was very important. I don't know if you can imagine this importance for Latin America and for Brazil in particular. We here are very glad with the Bolsonaro's isolation in the global scenario. I want to speak about the details on the analysis of the situation opened by the pandemic, but I would like to touch one element more, that is the resistance and the growth of the struggles. It's important.
You have 5 minutes more, Anna Cristina.
Okay, I'm finished. The resistance did not stop and are growing. 2019 was a year of great mobilizations, democratic and anti-neoliberal in 32 countries. There was a lot of democratic and anti-neoliberal riots all around the world, all around the 5 continents. Our hypothesis is that resistance to this intolerable, to this situation, terrible situation, social, economic, and political situation, tends to increase the social conflict. This doesn't mean that we locate a change in the balance of forces between the bourgeoisie and the social movements. It's not true yet, but it's evident that it's clear that we had, even under the pandemic, a lot of struggles. Women, youth for climate changes, against the climate changes, and a lot of other sectors. Of course, this increasing in the struggles with some victories, but always partial victories, have a great contradiction, because more the struggles, more the resistance, more it appears more clear the absence of an alternative, a broad alternative of the exploited and not oppressed people. In this situation, we must redouble our efforts to take initiatives aimed to converge the struggles, to convergence of struggles, to encourage the self-organizations from the bottom, to struggle for the international solidarity and organization to be stronger. It's a very difficult issue in our days. We are talking with 12 or 15 organizations of socialists in PSOL, are talking with 12 or 50 parties and organizations in Latin America, for example. But it's very complicated to build some internationalist initiatives. And I will finish remarking that to rebuild this anti-systemic left that was defeated in the last experiences, just like Syeda, just like Podemos, just like Corbyn and Sanders, is insisting in participate in make part of the resistance struggles and fighting to the convergence of the struggles. Only in this territory, only in this scenario, you can rebuild a systemic left, and we think it's better than we are contradictory, no? Better than we are 5 or 10 years ago. I think it's all.
Thank you so much, Anna Cristina. Okay, so I'm very pleased to introduce our final speaker, and not because he's our final speaker. So Gilbert Achcar is a Lebanese socialist, a professor at the School of African and Oriental Studies, and the author of many books, including The Clash of Barbarisms, The Arabs and Holocaust, and Morbid Symptoms, Relapse in the Arab Uprising. Gilbert, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry. Yeah, glad to be here with you in this meeting, you all. Right. Okay. So, I mean, of course, I'll be speaking in the same framework, let's say, that the previous two speakers. I think we have a broad agreement on many issues, but let me try to bring in some way different light. I would start by saying that we are facing two pandemics, one of which is much more research than the other. That is, you have a lot, very intensive research going on about the causes of the COVID pandemic, connection to climate crisis and the rest. But there's another pandemic, which is, in my view, more worrying, and probably in the view of everyone here, which is the far-right pandemic. We have been we have been seeing an ongoing far-right pandemic now for several years globally. And it culminated in some way with the election of Donald Trump. Without prompting the necessary research about the causes, the deep causes, except for the very local, every time very local causes are sought instead of looking to the broader picture. And indeed, this is a far-right pandemic when you think of all the progresses made by the far right, including fascist-like organization or neo-fascist organizations and movement. And that is really global, and hence the term pandemic is very much justified. Think of, yes, we've been speaking about Bolsonaro. Think of Modi in India. That's very much a neo-fascist government. Think of course, we have Trump in the United States. We have Duterte in Philippines. We have, including not fully neo-fascist, but very much hard-right governments in Russia, for instance, with Putin, Egypt, other countries. So it's really a global phenomenon. And of course, Europe, we are all familiar with Europe, with the shock that Salvini represented for a country like Italy, when you think of what the kind of balance of forces you had in that country a few decades, very few decades ago. That's very much striking. And yes, it has been mentioned, Phil mentioned the threat represented by the fascist Le Pen movement in France. Sweden, I mean, of all countries, where that's the kind of country where we wouldn't have even imagined that you could have something like a fascist movement, and yet you have one of the strongest far-right fascist movement in Europe today. So, and you know, we can continue, the list is long, not to mention Eastern Europe, where the governments like Orban, of course, fits very much into this far-right pandemic picture. So we are really facing a pandemic, a political pandemic. And indeed, there are, of course, one historical precedent, at least. There is one historical precedent, which is the interwar years of the previous century, when in the 20s and 30s, you had this global rise of fascism, which was, yes, global, but more into the global north than the global south, whereas this one is more global in the full sense. We're really in the age of globalization in every respect, and also in this respect. And I think that the deep reason of this is actually connected to the deep reason of the previous one, after the last century. It is related to the kind of crisis of capitalism into which we are. And essentially for our time, the neoliberal changes that started being implemented massively in the 1980s. So we've had already 4 decades of neoliberalism that with their dismantlement of social safety nets, with their precarization of life and all that, have created the ground for identity-based movement, which many of which are far-right movement, which become movements rejecting anyone not belonging to their identity. And in conjunction with neoliberalism, we've had the collapse of the Soviet Union and the massive discredit to the idea of socialism that this represented. None of us here, I presume, regarded the Soviet Union as a model of socialism, but beyond that, our circles, the vast majority of humanity were used to believe that that is the model of socialism, and even of Marxist socialism or communism or whatever. So the conjunction of all this is what led and facilitated this far-right pandemic that disrupted whatever kind of immunity there existed before, and created a ground for the very fast spread of this, which was, of course, boosted in the last few years by the Great Recession of 2008, which is a turning point. You can see how it accelerated the far-right, the growth of the far-right globally. And in the case of Europe, we can add, because we are located in Europe and it's very important, the massive wave of refugees from the Syrian conflict in 2015 was a key argument, a key issue seized upon by fascist movements in Europe, all kind of racist movement in Europe, Islamophobic movement, and the rest in their growth. So this is the picture. Now, we are in the midst of a right pandemic, but indeed there are counter elements emerging, and I think we can say that there has been also, on the other hand, a new wave of youth radicalization happening globally. Which is quite different again from that of the 60s and 68 and all that. Very different ideologically and politically, because it doesn't have the same references. And in the meantime, you have had the collapse of the Soviet Union. Don't forget this, and that's very important. And the shift of China to becoming a capitalist, to resorting to massively capitalist economic model. So, but we have seen, there has been, and I would say that the Arab Spring, as it was called in 2011, which was labeled at the time as a youth, all uprisings, and indeed, there are no uprisings done by people over 60, and there are usually always young people who do the uprisings in history. Uprisings are essentially, when you look at the vast majority of the participants, young people. And we've had, the Arab Spring was at a regional level, at the whole region, you had a real radicalization against the government. And then that was inspiring for other countries like Spain, like Greece, like even the United States. The Occupy movement, as we know, was inspired by what happened in Egypt at that point. And this radicalization took also the form of the Corbyn and Sanders phenomena in the UK and the United States. I mean, when you think of it, in 2016, the major surprise, if you look at the United States, was not Donald Trump, because Donald Trump was just the continuity of something that started with the conservative revolution of Ronald Reagan, a sharp shift to the right of the Republicans in the United States, and that went through the George W. Bush administration, which was in its time the furthest to the right ever in U.S. history. You had the Tea Party against Obama, a very racist movement rising. And then Trump was the outcome of all that. The ground was prepared for the Trump phenomenon to come. So the real surprise 2016 was not Trump, it was Sanders. That was, I mean, that was harder to imagine for any of us, I would say, that we would see such a movement, such millions of young people, mostly young people, supporting a candidate calling himself socialist in a country like the United States. That's absolutely amazing. And of course, the Corbyn phenomenon, even here, even though that this is not the United States, but that was also a massive, massive surprise. I don't think anyone can say I had predicted or I was expecting this to happen. That was a surprise to everybody, including Corbyn himself, I'm sure. And this has continued. 2019, we have had a second wave of the Arab Spring, as it was called. You had 4 countries where you had uprisings on top of the 6 of 2011, not to mention all other countries where you had sharp rises of social movements. You've had movements in Chile, in Hong Kong, in Thailand, in France, the Gilets jaunes in France. You have had a real global wave of radicalization. And here again, mostly young people. And this culminates also a few months ago, last year, with the Black Lives Matter. According to an investigation of the New York Times, this is the largest movement ever in US history. And the estimates is between 15 and 26 million people were on the streets. So that's absolutely massive. So we have to take all these issues into account. They are very, very important. But I would say that, yes, indeed, the problem, the key issue that all this is facing is that there is a lack of model. There is a lack of political and even one could say theoretical, if you want, in the sense of revolutionary theory, clarity, including. So I mean, this points to the need to aggiornamento, a renewal of political theory, of revolutionary ideology, and of the organizational models. That's very important. I think here in this country, Left Unity tried to invent an organizational model, which in my view was a very good step forward. And that points to the kind of reconsideration and reimagination of organization, of the language, of politics and all that. This is absolutely important because the new generation is allergic to the past forms of organizations. And I would say for very good reason. Yeah, they are allergic to the caudillism, the authoritarian, the so-called democratic centralism, which is very bureaucratic, etc., etc. There is a very, and even the term party is not that attractive. It's even repulsive, actually, for many young people. The fact that in the UK and the US, the radicalization, paradoxically, a youth radicalization seeks 2 old guys as symbols in the persons of Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, this is very much striking. But the fact is that they look to these guys as honest figures, you know, and given the fact that they are quite old, not the source of some kind of authoritarian project. So we have really to think of that. We have, I mean, the term that has been very much seen in the media over the last few years, since the Arab Spring actually in 2011, is leaderless. And the formula leaderless movements. And indeed, you have had leaderless movement in the sense that you no longer have those charismatic leaders and all that of the movements, no longer have the vanguard party leading the movement or whatever. It is different. And one of the most interesting experiences I have had the privilege, I would say, to witness is in Sudan, where I saw that the youth, the young people had created a grassroots horizontal organization using the Facebook and all these social media things to coordinate, and very allergic against even any form of centralization. They coordinate, they are very efficient, but they don't even want to create some kind of body called Central Committee or whatever committee, whatever name it has, even coordination in that sense. So they coordinate through the social media without creating a body called, you know, this. So all this is to be taken into account. And I would say in the kind of statements, any attempt to reach the young generation, the new generation, should beware of repeating the kind of literature of the past. You know, to start a text with a quotation by Leon Trotsky is disastrous. It's the best way to repel a lot of potential readers. They will stop at this because that would look religious. So we have, I think, to take into account the fact that there is the real need for renewal. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert. Okay, so we've got about half an hour for discussion, thanks to our three speakers, because of what we had to fit in with this session. We will curtail the break so that we start our next session on time. So as I said before, if comrades want to speak, whether it's to ask a question or make a comment, you can have up to 3 minutes. And please raise your hands in the chat, and I'll try and balance people. Okay, so I've got Rowan and then Dave, and of course people don't have to take 3 minutes, so over to you, Rowan.
Thank you. Apologies everyone for...
Sorry, Rowan, you need to turn yourself up.
Oh, absolutely. Is that better?
Yeah.
Better? Good, good. Apologies everyone, I'm having all kinds of technical issues, including microphone and internet issues. Really interesting talk from Gilbert and Anna, highlighting the scale of the crisis, and I think it picks up well on themes that we established with, and unfortunately I came sort of into the earlier discussion halfway through. I'm really interested in the talk about the origins of this mass far-right movement and sort of tracing it back to 2015 in the United States to the Tea Party context. And I think that's all very true. But I also think that I mean, of course, there's always antecedents of antecedents of antecedents, but I think that it's really interesting to see that the role that the internet played in the early noughties of the formation of a lot of this, leading up to 2008, but very much crystallizing in that financial crisis. And I remember being on communities in YouTube in the early noughties and seeing just how incredibly toxic and reactionary views were becoming in online spaces. And there's a vacuum of theory here, which to connect to the idea that we need more theory about why the internet is especially conducive to these things, above and beyond the mere social circumstances that surrounds the internet. And I think that has a lot to do with the architecture of the internet itself, but how that architecture has been shaped by capitalist forces that have created it and molded it for their purposes, often rentier purposes, not some kind of conspiratorial thing, but the way that the internet plays into extremism, I think, is actually tied to the way that the internet is designed as an advertising platform. And there's a lot to talk about here, so I won't sort of go at length, but I think it's a really important area to look at the emergence of this from the online spaces, because I think that isn't going away anytime soon, and I think it's actually going to continue to play left, and our attempts to organize, which is going to have to be through online spaces. Thank you.
Thanks, Rowan. I'll take Dave and then Jamie and then Mike.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, I agree with what Rowan just said about the importance of a left intervention around the internet. Absolutely crucial. What I wanted to raise is another question, which, although I agree overall with the document and Phil and the other speakers' interventions, I think we do have to consider the possibility that there might be governments that are Keynesian and have a Keynesian type approach following the COVID pandemic, and what you might call the centre. There could be a reawakening of the centre in certain countries and certain places. Now, this won't be a solution, don't get me wrong. I'm not arguing against the overall framework we're operating in, but I do think we should include the possibilities that you could have, for instance, in England, a Starmer type government, which won't be a Corbyn government, but will maybe have reflationary anti-austerity aspects to it, yeah? And therefore, for the left, for us, we have to relate to that in the correct fashion. If we just assume that everything is going to go, either to the far right or will it be a revolutionary explosion, we have got problems. We have to understand there are variations, there are possibilities in different countries. That's very, very important. Another point I wanted to make is I think it's very important that we, as a tendency, are very clear that we are opposed to all the campist type approaches on the revolutionary left at the moment. And what do I mean by campism? It means reduce all struggles to a struggle against American imperialism. Therefore, we hold back on criticizing the Putin government over the atrocious repression of Navalny and his supporters. Even though Navalny is not a left-wing person, you have to defend his right to organize. You have to defend his right to free speech. Similarly with the Uyghurs in China. It's incredible to see on Facebook and elsewhere, comrades who are, I'd say, part of the left, if you like, coming out and refusing to support the freedom of these people because they have this campist approach. They say it's all to do with the CIA and the American imperialists manipulating the situation to their advantage. So against campism, let's also take into account the possibility of, if you like, a revival of the centre in a temporary and a weak way, but a possibility.
Thanks, Dave. Jamie, if you got back in. No, Jamie was...
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Sorry, I joined the meeting on two separate things. I was going to walk around the house. Happy Saturday, everyone, and I hope you're having a lovely week. So I'm really interested in talking about the point that a fellow person made about the lines we need to organise and the youth. I think a critical part of left organising that has been missed out is, well, first of all, when we talk about the old times and we talk about the working of trade union lines and traditional forms of building solidarity, I think that in this Brave New World, which you could call these days. The lines are very different, and I don't see us making a movement of mass support through the trade union movement. I identify areas such as the dance music movement or other areas of traditional genres like rock or punk. Sorry, one second. But what I'm really interested in getting at is this concept of a revolutionary dance movement, which would look at, so for those of you who don't know, dance music came out of the Second Summer of Love, which was in 1988-89. It was like the first Summer of Love, it was a time of countercultural change, and it created pressures inside society that either would have revolutionized society, or as a result of the status quo not wanting to change, it got absorbed by the status quo, which has left us with the dance music scene we see today. But I think it's very critical that we go back and look at and go back to the values and ideas where it came from, and look at how we can use the net of dance music and the arts culture. By net, I mean like the fishing net, being the wideness of the net is huge. It crosses all cultural lines. And I really, really think that when we look at the organising the youth, it needs to be through non-traditional, outside the box means. And I think looking at through the lens of dance music, you could really build up a movement of sufficient support from the catch you're able to bring in. And I've been developing this format for a dance rave that would look at getting people, the format would be, how do you get people aware about the ideas of the night? The second part would be, how can you produce content to support the series that would get the public consciousness and public conversation in the industry about the idea? And the third critical one, which we'll be keen to talk about tomorrow, is how can we develop clear and accessible and efficient avenues to get people active through? Being at parties, people can say, oh, I'm really interested in getting involved in climate change, but how can we have defined avenues that are efficient and quick and easy to get into to get them involved? Because time is of the essence. We've got 3 years to the next election, and all I can think about is how we can build a movement outside of politics to force positive and lasting change in society. I think a big part of it can be done through dance, and furthermore, other genres such as rock, punk, and jazz, And yeah, that's all I had to say, and thank you. And I hope you all heard me all right, and I look forward to tomorrow.
Thanks very much, Jamie. Mike?
The phenomena behind 73 million people voting for Donald Trump is very interesting and significant, but the most significant factor coming out of the American election is that Trump lost, and that on Biden's first day in office, he signed the agreement to re-enter the Paris Climate Accords and to commit to going to COP26 in Glasgow in November of this year. And I think that's a key focus that revolutionaries in Britain need to establish and work on over the coming period, because it's fairly clear that since the Paris Agreement of 2015, there has not been the sort of change that is necessary, and the need for mass pressure on a global scale on leaders of governments across the world is becoming even more significant, and it is becoming an issue of survival or death. So as we approach the COP, I think it will be very important that, particularly because one of the unexpected consequences of the COVID crisis, or the consequences of the unexpected COVID crisis, is the grounding of global aviation, that the nature of the COP protest itself will fundamentally change. And that whereas in previous COPs we've seen hundreds of thousands of people descend on cities across the world and challenge governments in those cities, that's clearly not going to happen by this November. And therefore the possibility of a decentralized global movement across countries of the world focusing on demands on the COP, but taking place within their own countries, becomes a possibility. And we've seen the way in which the school climate strikes and so on have captured the imagination of people. And I think such a process is going to continue. And the fact that it is the UK government that is hosting the COP, and it's taking place in Scotland, probably at a time in which the independence movement will be reaching its peak, makes that process doubly important for eco-socialists across the world. And so I do hope that we can all get involved in that process, which will in particular take its next stage in March with the From the Ground Up to digital event to mobilize and support that process.
Thanks, Mike. Nadia, and then Mark, and then me.
Hello. Thank you to all the speakers. So I have two questions. One is like general and direct, and it's to all speakers. So I question like how potentially would be the mechanisms or the strategies to organize labor in this increasing informal structure, informal sector that we are realizing, under this neoliberal epoch, let's say. The other one is more directly to Dr. Gilbert, and it's actually like somehow when you were claiming that radicalization is more among the young sector, the young age. So to me, somehow this such a generalization, even if one can like substantiate it with historical uprisings or insurgencies. But I think like such a generalization needs to be somehow be revisited, because once one adds the class analysis variable, one might claim that such a claim might be true when it comes to middle class protests, because it might depend more on increasing the consciousness of the people and the education of the people. But I think when it comes to the poor class, to the like those that you call the precarious, I think age doesn't play a variable anymore, because what is at stake is their survival, their basic needs. So I think like when it comes to these, to these poor masses, I don't think like age would play a determining factor. And we can see this historic revolt that we are witnessing now in India. So we see the old and the young together in the streets. So what do you think of that? Thank you.
Thank you. Mark.
Is it Mark Finley, Terry?
I'm trying to unmute myself. Sorry, I've just managed to do that now. In general, I'm completely in favour. It's basically an answer to Jamie Anker's point about rave culture and so on. In general, I'm completely in favour of being involved with cultural activities, as many of you will know. However, we need to be aware of that some of these aren't necessarily radical in the way that we would wish. And some of them also, I think a lot of these could be involved with sort of anti-science and sort of quotes alternative anti-lockdown activities, which are actually potentially quite dangerous. I'm not really sure about what the rave culture is, and it's been spoken of here, but I think what we do need to be able to connect to is cultural movements that come from the, obviously from the British sort of the black people's things like reggae and more. I mean, reggae is probably a very old one, but I mean, some of these have very radical content, and we need to be able to connect to those. But I think we need to be very cautious about how we pick particular things, because they could lead us onto something that we don't necessarily be in favour of. Ended. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. I just wanted to say a couple of things about comments that I think all the speakers made about the nature of the attack on women in the first pandemic that Phil talks about, the COVID pandemic, but also about women's resistance, because it seems to me that it is important, first of all, to recognize that what's been happening to women during the pandemic is both a revelation and a deepening of the oppression that we faced in the pre-pandemic situation. Slogans such as stay home to be safe don't take into account the amount of violence that exists in many people's homes, the imposition of home working on a whole layer of people who are able to work from home in the pandemic has meant that women's burden in social reproduction has been massively increased. Phil's right to say that for some women that's resulted in them being forced out of the labour market, but for other women it's just been a further burden. And we can see from the stats that although the amount of work in the home that men have done has gone up marginally, it's gone up far more times for women. At the same time, I think it's important to recognise, Phil mentioned the victory on abortion in Argentina and also the situation in Poland. I don't know if comrades have seen that on Wednesday night, the Polish government finally published the law that they were unable to publish in November because of the strength of the protests on the streets and in the squares of every Polish city. Those mobilizations have started again. We need to be ready to be involved in solidarity action in this country. But I think we should also note the huge role of women in other mobilizations. For example, the mobilization that changed the Chilean constitution and throughout that imposed by Pinochet was a movement led by women. So it's not only women organizing amongst about our own demands, but leading broader social movements. And I think that is a deepening of a process that we've seen before, but an extension of it, which we should celebrate. And finally, a very specific question to Cristina. There was a very horrible incident that happened in Brazil on Tuesday, Wednesday, and if you could speak about that and whether it would be appropriate to send a message of solidarity to the comrade who was attacked, I think that would be helpful. Thank you. Jude.
Thanks, Terry. First of all, I want to say thank you so much to the speakers. This has been such an interesting session and such an exciting opportunity to hear about some of the ways that people are engaging with these issues and theorizing these kinds of questions in different ways from different perspectives and in different parts of the world. I just want to speak a little to the points made by Jamie and Nadia about interacting with different movements and different groups of people that are already in existence, because it seems to me like this is the strength of an organization like ACR, is that we can engage with that kind of pluralism that says, okay, so beyond the kind of broad anti-capitalist approach that we are all taking, there is no obligation, there's no requirement that we all hold precisely the same views or expectations or opinions about what ought to be the case, but rather to say we recognize the solidarity of mutual struggles, and therefore the wide, huge variety and diversity of movements that are already in progress are things in which we can be involved. And so finding ways of connecting to already existing groups, already existing movements, and really meeting people where they are, rather than expecting people to come to where we are in order to make a difference, seems to me to be the only way, really, that we can respond to the extraordinary circumstances and oppressions that we find ourselves in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jude. I've got Paul Crofts, who for some bizarre reason doesn't seem to have a hand he can put up. So I'll take Paul next. If anybody else wants to speak, let me know either by raising your hand or messaging me while Paul's speaking. Otherwise, I'll bring the speakers back. in reverse order. Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. I just wanted to raise the issue more centrally. It's been referred to, but I would like to make it more central about the whole issue of racism in the rise of the far right. To my mind, it goes back not to the last 5-10 years, but the use of racism, anti-refugee, anti-immigrant feeling goes back to the 1970s and 80s. And the twists and turns of the way our immigration in the UK, the twists and turns of immigration policy, which is always tightening. There's never been, as far as I'm concerned, any significant loosening of immigration controls, but rather year on year, governments, both Labour and Conservative, have tightened immigration controls against both the families and of existing migrants, immigrants, but also against refugees, the use of the hostile environment in recent years. All this has fueled and contributed towards the rise of the far right. And of course, that's interlinked with the refugee crisis that's also been referred to, largely caused by wars and interventions from the US and Britain and others, particularly in the Middle East, in Iraq and what have you. And that kind of acts as a feedback, a constant feedback loop that's then combined with the austerity neoliberal policies that have been pursued since Thatcher and also were pursued by under Blair, which decimated working class communities in terms of industries. So again, you've added in another feedback loop, which fuels racism. And I think that the left needs to see the fight against racism and racist views and a kind of social democratic kind of nationalism, the racist nationalism which is now being generated, as central to our political strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So I haven't got anybody else indicating to speak, so I'll ask Gilbert to come back first for 3 or 4 minutes, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Okay. No, I mean, very quickly on the women, the role of women in the struggles. I think that the most important to note is not the Polish case, where it is an attack on women, and women are responding to the attack on women. So it's on a specific women issue. But what is more striking is the prominent role of women in various struggles of a general character. The prominent role of women in the Sudan revolution. There was a mention of the role of women in the Lebanese uprising of last year. Think of Belarus, for instance, where I mean, this is a country no one mentioned, but you had a massive movement in Sweden, and the key leading figures were women. I mean, that is much more striking and actually important in the significance of the deep social meaning of it than of course fight back on issues like abortion or the rest, as in Poland, which is of course very important. It's not to belittle it, but just to say that it is the other that is more the novelty in what we have. On the issues raised by Nadia, thank you for this. I mean, yes, the informal, if you mean it in the sociological sense or the economic sense, the informal sector, which is absolutely massive in the global south, yeah, the organization of the informal sector has always been a key problem for social struggles. But that's here where we see that this old kind of of conception of the factory-based cell organization, all that well, this is very much Petrograd or maybe parts of industrialized Europe in the 20th century, but this is not exactly the kind of organization that we see now. I mentioned Sudan, for instance, where it is on the basis of neighborhood committees of these young people. And that's where you have all the informal, the unemployed. The unemployed are massive number and all that organizing. And here I'm speaking not of a few hundred or even few thousand. We're speaking of an absolutely massive organization. So that's very, very important. About the youth, no, I mean, of course, when you have a category like the farmers in India that is attacked, you will have all the farmers, whatever their age. Yeah, you're right on that. But if you look at the uprisings that we have, Hong Kong, Chile, the Arab countries, the United States, Black Lives Matter, and all that, it is overwhelmingly young people. And that's normal. I mean, that's absolutely how it is. And of course, the precarious, the unemployed, and all that are, their proportion among the young is higher than the rest of the population. And that's a further cause, a further reason for their radicalization. And I'll end by pointing to the fact that I mean, the reaction to precarization can be different also depending to age. In older age, it might go to the right. And that's why actually you see all these, the polls showing that the older are more to the right, the younger are more to the left. And well, we should be happy that it's not the contrary, because that's the best sign we could have for the future.
Thank you, Gilbert. And Cristina.
I strongly agree with the Achcar analysis. I think we see in Latin America, for instance, the main role in the struggles are from the young girls, 20, 30 years old. And in Brazil, for instance, young Black girls, they are they conduct everything against Bolsonaro, against solidarity initiatives, and from the COVID, everything. It doesn't mean that the old guys, just like us, were not fighting, struggling, but they are the leaders, and it's good. It's very important for us. It's very important for us we had, through the PSOL in Brazil, we had the opportunity to know a group of Democratic Socialists of America young leaders. They are very, very young. All these phenomena around the socialists in the Democratic Party or out of the Democratic Party in the United States are almost kids. They are almost kids. It's impressive. It's good for that's the meaning, that's the reason for the radicalization Achcar expressed. I like very much the comparison. Of course, it's different in many ways. The comparison with the uprise from the 60s in the 19th century, because it's very, have a lot of coincidence, It doesn't mean that we in Brazil had an uprise of the guys that deliver, I don't know the name in English, the guys that deliver food in iFood, Happy, Uber Eats. these guys are almost 9% are guys from 19 years old to 30. It's a new kind of youth, a worker class making in its making. You know? And well, I think it's of course, it's not a completely generalized phenomenon. It's not a, we have exceptions, of course, but that's the trend of the, around the question made by Terry, we had an attack last week, 2 or 3 days ago, against a co-consular of the PSOL in São Paulo, in my city. And she's a Black trans activist. It's the most vulnerable sector in the world. And the far right here, Bolsonaristas, the far right, the Brazilian far right, loves to attack this kind of people. They are all our representatives in city councils and representative chambers, all are under threats of death. The situation is very, very serious for us. All the young and mostly Black and trans activists. You can imagine the hate of this far right for all very young. But Carol is okay, and we are fighting to defend all our companions. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Cristina. I just put a link to an article that gives you a bit more information about the attack. Bill.
Okay. Well, a very interesting discussion, very rich discussion, and I can't comment on it all, but I'm just going to say a few things. First of all, I was very interested in the things said by Anna Cristina about militarism and militarized accumulation and the role of the military in production and the role of the military and militarized production and accumulation today. A lot of this has been explained in some detail in the book by William I. Robinson called Global Police State. And I think better than, as far as I know, by anybody else. He's in the lead on that. And it's a very significant thing for the role of the military sector in government and in power. And it reaches right down into the police organizations as well as the military organizations, and the huge role that military companies play in contemporary capitalism, including the deep integration of the IT sector in military production, including, for example, Facebook, which has massive contracts with the US military. I'm going to put a link to William I. Robinson's book, The Global Police State. Oh, yeah, in the chat. I wanted also to take up the question of the danger, of course, although we don't want to take a campist position. Dave Kellaway was absolutely right on that, in defense of China. It's some kind of Maoism or something like that, absurd. But nonetheless, there is a real danger at some point down the line of a military clash between the United States and China, which is a real danger and which we have to campaign against. Look, I was also, I appreciated very much the contribution made by Paul Croft towards the end there, because he explained the interaction in a very good way, the dialectic of the interaction between racism, the refugee crisis, especially with people from Syria, and the way that that is used, that is the key mobilizing thing for the far right, obviously, and the rise of racism and nationalism, which we experience in this country through Brexit, although a large part of the left didn't understand that. And that is a key thing for us to fight in the next period. And I would say, in a general sense, I know it sounds a bit liberal, but you know, I pose it as the defense of multiculturalism, the defense of multiculturalism against ethnic nationalism and xenophobia. Okay. Yeah, look, there was a very interesting discussion about organisation and different milieu and the way we can reach out to them and so on, by Jamie and, is it Nadia? Or was it Nadine? Is it Nadine or Nadia?
Nadia.
Nadia, yeah, Nadia, I was right. Okay, Nadia's right, because if you're working in a union like NUPE, yeah, you'll often get involved in struggles in which lots of older people participate with, you know, trade union militancy. The real question, though, is where can we find the people who are really radical and anti-system, not just militants at the level of the trade unions? And, you know, without a shadow of a doubt, well, Gilbert and Cristina and other comrades have explained it, Terry, as well, about the role of youth and of women and of young women in struggles globally, and how we reach out to those people is very important. I was very interested in the contribution made by Jamie in that respect. We need to discuss it, and we need to discuss all the ways in which we can use culture, alternative culture, revolutionary culture. I don't know, I can't remember who it was who said that sometimes that reactionary forces can intervene in this culture as well. Well, if we don't, reactionary forces as well. We saw at the time of punk, the mobilization of punks, some punks, so-called punk groups around fascist ideas. But I was also very struck by the contribution from Jude, and about how revolutionaries should, we can't impose, you know, a tight framework. Now we have the Revolutionary Party, linked to the Revolutionary Party, we have the rank and file movement, you know, like front organisations based on the factories, whatever. That's completely out now. We can't do that. And the sensibility towards the distrust for authoritarianism and authoritarian forms of organisations, which Gilbert explained, was very to the point, I thought. You know, the next word that's coming is going to be but. However, within that, within an organisation which can reach out to all kinds of cultural groups in which there's a diversity of activity towards the youth in a non-democratic centralism, non-hierarchical way, we need a focus for political discussion, theoretical elaboration, and strategic elaboration, which only a revolutionary organisation, a mass or a militant socialist organisation can provide, and that's what we're attempting to do with the ACR. That's it.
We've got 3 speakers today, but I'm going to call first on Simon Hanna, who is a member of the Anti-Capitalist Resistance Steering Committee. Simon is a socialist and a trade union activist, author of 3 books, A Party with Socialists in It, A History of the Labour Left, Can't Pay, Won't Pay, the fight to stop the poll tax, and Radical Lambeth. So over to you, Simon, and you've got 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, I was here, but I was muted by Zoom. So thank you very much. And also thank you to everyone who's attended the conference today. So just to kind of talk about some of the perspectives for a socialist organisation in Britain today. If people were also here in the first session, we went through a lot of the contradictions that you can see around the world. Obviously, climate change, the growth of the far right, the continued prevalence of neoliberal politics, the hollowing out of the centre, and then the centre's attempt to kind of fight back and re-establish itself, and the emergence of various social movements and movements of solidarity, fighting around a range of issues, from kind of pro-democracy campaigns through to social struggles and struggles of the oppressed and so on. And Britain, you know, doesn't escape any of those contradictions that we can see globally. In fact, if anything, Britain is, you could argue, maybe a bit of a vanguard country in terms of the way that these global phenomena that we can see are playing themselves out. I think Phil in the first session talked about if we were having a, you know, the conference back in kind of 2016 or something like that, if we were meeting in 2010, then we would have 10 years ahead of us, which we know most of us would be aghast if we knew what was coming. Obviously, we had the austerity agenda, which was unfortunately largely successful. In other words, the kind of conservative and coalition government at the time got its way in terms of a large number of the cutbacks they wanted to make. We had the Scottish referendum, which obviously massively deepened the national question in Britain. Brexit, of course. And all the contradictions that led up to Brexit caused the Brexit vote, and then the way that we've seen it unravel since. The unexpected rise and fall of the Labour left. I think there's lots of us on the call who, you know, were taken quite surprise at how quickly the Labour left grew so massively when Corbyn managed to get on the onto the leadership ballot, and then obviously with Labour's defeat in the 2019 general election. You know, we've seen a lot of that energy and momentum, small m as well as large m, that went into the Labour left dissipate. Obviously, climate change, the movements around climate change, the strikers, the school strikers, Black Lives Matters, we've had those protests as well in the UK, and now of course we're meeting over Zoom because of a global pandemic in which Britain has got the highest death rate in the world. So the last 10 years has been incredibly unstable, and I think we can just expect that to continue. I know lots of friends on social media, every time there's a New Year's Eve, they like, well, you know, I hope next year is going to be a bit more calm than the last year. And of course it never is, because the things that are making life so precarious, so unbalanced, and politics so intense in terms of its range and depth of instability, those dynamics aren't going away. In fact, they're going to deepen. And because of that, that's a large reason why, obviously, we're taking the step of launching Anti-Capitalist Resistance as a revolutionary socialist organisation, a plural multi-tendency group, because when faced with the scope and enormity of the challenges facing us, we know that it's not enough to sit in kind of small sects and just sort of analyse what's going on. We have to try and build greater unity, fighting unity of the socialist left, in order to be able to make any impact on the huge world events that are going on. The fact that we have a government led by Boris Johnson, who is a joke politician. I mean, I thought it was hilarious when he was Foreign Secretary. Even more ridiculous that he's actually our Prime Minister, and also a living example of how simply being an arrogant, mediocre member of the ruling establishment can get you quite far in British politics. His government is not going to go away anytime soon, despite the huge death rate. I mean, his poll ratings are quite high, and certainly Labour is struggling to match them, let alone overcome them. The nature of the Boris Johnson government is something that we need to think about very seriously, because Obviously, there will be elements of austerity carrying on, and we have to be, I mean, there's a big factor that we can't really kind of analyze in any depth at the moment, which is the kind of economic impact that the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns has had and is going to have. But certainly the government in its initial period was not one of just continuing the austerity agenda as was set by its predecessors. Indeed, if anything, the Boris Johnson government was a bit more infused with the idea of the sort of populist right Trumpian idea of kind of rebuilding the nation, kind of strengthening the economy, investing in infrastructure and so on. And certainly Rishi Sunak's response to the pandemic so far has not just been one of slash and burn, cut everything. They have been forced to implement what you might describe in some ways Keynesian measures, just in order to keep the country afloat. Whether that continues into the foreseeable future as the lockdown hopefully begins to unravel as the vaccines are rolled out isn't clear. But certainly I think that what we could be seeing is a government which, wants to make the nation strong in the way that the bourgeoisie understand making the nation strong. There could well be some investment in some areas. And so therefore the scope and the nature of the criticism of it will very likely need to change from the kind of general broad left criticisms that were made of the previous conservative governments. Obviously the caveat there, as I pointed out, is we don't know what's really going to happen to the economy after the pandemic. Looking at the Labour Party, anti-capitalist resistance is founded on the idea that you don't need to leave the Labour Party to be in the ACR. We're not going to be standing candidates in elections against Labour. So some of our members are in Labour, some of our members are not in Labour. And that's absolutely fine. We want to build a broad socialist network which can be involved in Labour Party politics as well as engaging in politics in the wider kind of movement and so on. Looking at the Labour Party now, and I think there's going to be a debate around this, potentially a debate around this tomorrow in the members session. So if you're not a member, I'd encourage you to join so you can take part in that debate. We have to think about what the victory of Keir Starmer really means in terms of Labour's politics and the direction of the Labour Party. Certainly Labour has triangulated massively and rapidly towards the centre. I thought when Keir Starmer was standing and was elected, I thought that he'd be a kind of Neil Kinnock figure, i.e. someone that kind of was meant to learn the lessons of the Michael Foot so-called ultra-left era of Labour and was going to reorientate the party back to the pragmatic moderate centre in order to try and win back Tory voters. Whether Labour can win back Tory voters or not is an open question, as Neil Kinnock himself found out in the 1980s and in 1992. But certainly that is what Keir Starmer's aiming for. The issue that the Labour left has, of course, is that its project is seen to have failed. Now, people can say that's unfair, or they can say there's lots of reasons why, and they can blame the media, or they can blame Brexit, or they could blame all kinds of different things for it. But I think for your average Labour Party member, they are living in a post-Corbyn, post-Labour left political environment now. And certainly I think that any hopes of a significant revival of the Labour left to the point where it might be able to win an election or even kind of take control of the party again, I think there's a big, big question mark over that. Nevertheless, Labour is a site of struggle. It's important for socialists to be, it's still, the biggest party of the British working class and obviously has an organic connection to the trade unions, and therefore it would be sectarian to completely ignore or not be active in what is going on within Labour Party politics. But I think we'll have to factor in the idea that sort of the Corbyn era is in the past, and the Labour left, I think, will and already has declined quite considerably, and people will be looking for new politics, looking for new answers, looking for new analysis and new activity to get involved in. And certainly just going to CLP meetings and people banging their heads against a brick wall trying to pass motions which don't go anywhere, or even winning victories at Labour Party conference around important things, but then it never ends up in the manifesto. I think people will be there will be an appetite for a different kind of politics and a more radical, more consistent politics, and that again is, I think, where anti-capitalist resistance and hopefully other groups as well. We want to be working towards a wider realignment on the left that can try and fill that gap. Going forward, we've already seen social movements like Black Lives Matters and Extinction Rebellion and so on. And I think one of the important things around that is obviously to be involved in these movements when they emerge. You know, it's you shouldn't sort of have the attitude of these groups or these movements don't have exactly the right politics, therefore we're going to abstain from them. These are social movements of people fighting back against, you know, climate change, against racism and so on. And therefore the left clearly has to be involved in those projects. But we also have to do it in such a way that we can help build them, but also have comradely and constructive criticism of them. One of the problems of a lot of these movements is they're kind of up like a rocket, down like a stick. You kind of get this explosion of kind of activism and energy and sort of protests and so on. But they're always kind of filled with contradictions. I mean, even the BLM protests in the UK were hopelessly split. I mean, there was more than one BLM group calling protests, and there was a serious disagreement within Black Lives Matters UK over whether you should work with the government or not to tackle racism. And there was a left wing saying, you know, the government is a cause of a lot of the racism, and therefore we need to oppose them. And there was another wing of BLM that was saying, well, you know, you need to work with people in power in order to make change happen. So I think Marxists need to be aware that, you know, when there are movements of the oppressed emerging, it's not that they emerge with perfect politics or they've got all the answers to things. There's huge debates within those movements as well. And therefore being able to orientate to them, engage with them, and help develop some of the more left, more critical, anti-systemic, anti-capitalist arguments is going to be crucial to helping to rebuild and rejuvenate a healthy left in this country. So I think that's kind of some of the broad things around some of the movements, some of the politics, and so on that we're going to be seeing in the foreseeable future. Obviously, the COVID pandemic has meant that a lot of the political activity that most of us take to be bread and butter, you know, going out on protests, organising demonstrations, you know, doing stalls and kind of public petitions. We haven't really been able to do any of that for the last year, and won't really be able to do it for the foreseeable future, although hopefully by the summer or towards the end of the year, fingers crossed, I don't want to jinx anything, things will begin to return to a situation where we can do a bit more public campaigning. There's certainly things like the Zero COVID campaign and some of the pressure that is being brought to bear on a government that is frankly very interested in putting business before people and people's health is very important, even if a lot of that work is, you know, being done online at the moment because of the pandemic situation. That's something that we're going to have to be, you know, thinking about, but also thinking about the campaigns that will emerge after lockdown. We might very well have a huge number of unemployed people. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, thank you, Joseph. I'll just wind up now. We'll have a huge number of unemployed people. You know, there could be very serious kind of social consequences from the pandemic, from the way it was handled, mishandled, which is going to require quite radical political movements to be able to fight for people's rights, to be able to, you know, fight for people to get what they need. So to be able to build an organisation which is credible and serious and able to be constructive, engaged in those movements in a comradely way, but also making very clear anti-capitalist and socialist politics is going to be very important. So ACR has to cut through a lot of the confusion. It has to be very clear in what it's fighting for and what it stands for, as well as able to, you know, tolerate political differences and have a degree of plurality as well, in order to be able to be flexible enough to deal with the political challenges, obstacles and opportunities that will be facing the working class in the future. So I'll just wind up there.
Thank you, Simon. And as Simon said, tomorrow's session will be for members only. So if you're interested in coming along, join us today, and then you can take part in all those debates tomorrow. So our next speaker is Syeda, who's a trade union and migrants' rights activist, and she is one of the co-authors of Creeping Fascism, a book which, when it first came out, people didn't really take a lot of it seriously, but since then it's been proven a lot of its predictions have actually come true. So welcome, Seema.
Thank you, Joseph. Yes, sadly, a lot of the predictions in the book have slowly been coming true and slowly been unfolding in front of our very eyes, which is actually a very depressing thing. When you write a book, you usually hope that your thesis is correct, but I personally don't really want many of the things that we predicted to happen, and that's the reason why we wrote the book. A lot of people kind of attack the thesis and say, oh, it's not fascism, it's far right. But in the end, you don't want to wait to be in fascism before you react as though you're getting to fascism. The whole point is that we are on a trajectory towards a fascist state, not just in Britain, but across the world. And we need to feel the urgency to act to prevent getting to the worst possible outcomes. So I wasn't intending to talk too much about the Creeping Fascism book today, given the topic, but those are my sort of reflections on it for now. So firstly, I'd just like to say thank you for putting this together. I think it takes a lot of hard work with very little resources to start a group from scratch, and seeing the number of participants today, I'm really respectful and give a lot of kudos to everybody who made this happen. So today I'm going to talk broadly about the left. So I'm not aiming my critique at any specific groups, but I'm talking about the left generally. I think the left has got three key needs. Firstly, it needs to be internationalist from the start. So any groups that emerge need to be internationalist from the start in practice. Secondly, it needs to be anti-racist. And I think there's a lot of improvement that can be done with the left generally on tackling racism. And thirdly, it needs to be less hierarchical, and there needs to be more grassroots agency in left groups. So firstly, I'll talk about the problems with the left on internationalism. So I take slight issue, I'll be a bit cheeky, even with the framing of this panel, the idea of what's next for Britain, what's next for the left in Britain. I think the left does see itself far too much as the British left, and we kind of organise and we use our rhetoric and our discourse far too much about the British left. This is something I raised in an earlier talk to ACR, so some of you have probably heard some of these detailed arguments before. But I think the analytical framework of the nation state isn't very useful for the left anymore. I think we need to move beyond that. And I think when we look at what's happening in Britain, we should never separate it from what's happening internationally. And of course, there was a previous panel on internationalism, which unfortunately I wasn't able to make. So I'm sure you've discussed some of these issues there. But yeah, so I think the left really needs to move out of the nation state as our main organizing framework and the way we describe ourselves. There's also this myth that the working class is inherently patriotic and that it's like inherently attached to the local. But I think that's just not true on a cultural level and on an economic level as well. For instance, on a cultural level, most people in the UK consume American media, American TV shows. There's a lot of American culture that's sort of hegemonizing the globe. And most importantly, economically, the structures that we engage with are wholly international. So if you look at corporate structures like Amazon, if you look at pharmaceutical companies, if you look at big tech, Google, Microsoft, they're international corporations that don't really care about national borders or boundaries. And that's what the whole Brexit movement was about. It was international capital trying to break into, say, the European Union's more social democratic protections. And it acts in its interests in that way without the nationalist framing. But the nationalist framing is obviously useful for these actors, for these international actors, because it divides the working class and it makes it easier to rule over the working class and to control people. And it also supports the far right and reactionary governments to get power in national states so that workers can be exploited and labour rights can be degraded. So it is a construct of the right that the left, through the way that we act and through the way that we talk, need to deconstruct. And in terms of how we organise internationally, I think trade unionism and cross-border trade unionism from the very start, when trade unions are formed, they should have sort of international bases and branches and groups that are constantly interacting with each other across borders to foster this sense of an internationalist working class that is more loyal to workers in other places because we are all workers rather than to the worker next door. So those are some of the problems broadly with the rhetoric and the discourse, but there's also some very real serious consequences that this nationalist outlook has had on the British left. And that is firstly, the capitulation on Brexit. and not doing enough to combat racism, which is my next point. And then if you look at Biden and Starmer, the use of racism and the rise of nationalism can very easily undermine their own power. So Biden, what's happened at Capitol Hill is something that can still happen under Biden. It shows the weakness of the state, the unwillingness of the state to defend against fascists, and the fact that liberals, who are partly the cause of the rise of fascism, are not necessarily a protection against the continued rise of fascism. And I think with Starmer, we've seen his response to the Spy Cops bill. We've seen how he's dealt with free movement. He's also capitulating to this nationalist rhetoric. And we're just going to see it increasing just because we have moderates in power in America. That does not mean that the rise of the far right is going to stop. So how do we sort of solve this? I think partly, again, the British left should maybe stop seeing itself as the British left and think about itself in a more internationalist way. I think if we look at the state of Britain itself, the idea of Great Britain, it's disintegrating. It's just a colonial hangover. I don't think it's going to last very long anyway. So we need to be ahead of the game and reconstitute ourselves. In organizations, we be internationalists from the start. So with ACR, for instance, it has a very clear line on Brexit, has a very clear line about being a Marxist revolutionary organization. I think there are lots of activists across the European Union, for instance, who share that outlook. There are lots of Lexiters across Europe who are also Eurosceptic, but joining activists across Europe who also see like the Remain and Reform argument and want to remain in the European Union, but also have a revolutionary Marxist politics, and bringing them into the organization from the start and working with them actively from the start on campaigns is a good way to just be internationalist from the start. I want to say a lot more on this, but I'm going to move on to my next topic, which is racism. Now, I think racism is a huge issue on the left, and I don't think people have really looked about it deeply or analysed it deeply. It's something I want to analyse and look into a lot more when I have some more free time. I think the left does actually need a real reckoning on race, because I often hear quite lazy comments bandied around, for instance, about Black Lives Matter. People saying they don't engage with the labour movement because they've got too much of the wrong kind of identity politics, and that in the end it's all about class, and therefore identity is an important oppression, but it's not so important. But I think that analysis is the wrong way around. The reason why often, in my experience, you get lots of ethnic minority groups and anti-oppression groups who are not engaging with the labour movement is because the labour movement historically has not shown solidarity with these groups. So it's the labour movement historically, trade unions, for instance, have actually collaborated with, say, white workers when foreign workers have arrived to prefer white workers and privilege them. And there's a good book, which is Rennie Edo Lodge's book, Why I'm Not Talking to White People About Race. And there's a good chapter there that discusses the history of trade unionisms with some really good specific examples about how the labour movement has actually betrayed Black and brown workers. And I think until the left is really honest about that and starts talking about that, you won't be able to win the trust of people from ethnic minority groups. So it does work the other way as well. It's like, show your solidarity in practice first. And I think one of the ways this shows is the way that people talk about a lot of the elements of the working class who voted for Brexit. People say, no, they're not racists, they don't hate immigrants, they were just misled. But actually being honest about the extent and the depth of racism in this country and being willing to call people racist, not necessarily to humiliate them, but I know that will be in effect, but to actually confront the problem and deal with it is really, really important. So for instance, if you're a trade unionist and you've unionized your workplace and there's like a minority of Black and brown workers who are experiencing racism from other white workers, but you've unionized them all, there's that conflict there. How do you, if a white worker is in a disciplinary hearing for being racist to a worker who isn't white, like how do you resolve that conflict? And I think that's a very real issue. So thinking things like that through. And finally, I think you combat racism by being more grassroots and giving agency at a grassroots level, which is my next point, and I feel like I'm overrunning a lot. But anyone who was active in the Labour left, under Corbyn will know that the movement started off as this burst of radical energy, and then it ossified into a much more controlled operation where loyalty was policed and directions as to the party line came down from on high. And a lot of people talk about this in the context of Momentum's democratic structures being shut down, and how the Corbyn office handled the Brexit and free movement debate, which I'm sure Michael can tell you more about. But even those who are traditionally loyalist activists have actually seen this, because I was in the Green New Deal compositing meeting, and everyone who kind of militated for a 2030 target to end carbon emissions was being told by Rebecca Long-Bailey and Corbyn's office and the Unite bureaucracy that they need to get rid of that target. And there were Green New Deal activists crying in that compositing meeting. So it really did, you know, start even clamping down on those who were willing to toe the party line. So the problems of labourism and electoralism and triangulation, which lead to this sort of top-down hierarchy, Simon Hanna talks a lot about this in his book, so A Party with Socialists in It, so I recommend you read that. But I think the solution for a left organisation is the culture of the organisation from the beginning needs to be really grassroots. And people like to talk a lot about the constitutional structures and the democratic structures, and that's all fun for some politically involved people, but actually it's the micro level where it's really important. Small things matter. So I think making sure every single activist becomes a leader. So like the format of this panel is great for when you have a large group of people, but most of the time we shouldn't bring in speakers from on high who are like expert in this thing and who are really cool, or like John McDonnell or like Corbyn, and they speak for ages and then everyone else just listens. I think a good way to start is like getting every single member in the group to introduce themselves and get to say what they think first, and speakers are kind of introduced organically, and it's like an organic debate rather than someone talking at people. And things like, oh, who's going to be the next AOC? Is it like Nadia Whittome or Sarah Sultana? Both MPs that are really great. But in the end, that kind of talk is just not helpful because everybody needs to be the next AOC. So I think like empowering every single person to believe that they actually can be a leader and an activist and they can run stuff and do things is really, really important.
You have 2 minutes, Seema.
I have 2 minutes. Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought I've gone to 10 minutes now. Yeah, so I think getting interaction, getting participation is really important. So to conclude, my 3 main points are: let's be more internationalist, let's be more anti-racist, and let's build socialism from below and give agency to the grassroots. Thanks.
Thank you, Seema. Some very important points there. Our last speaker is Michael Chessum, whom I know quite well, having sat on the National Committee of Another Europe is Possible for the last few years. Michael is the national organizer for Another Europe is Possible, and he was an activist in the national campaign against fees and cuts. And he was also a leading member of Momentum, and I'm sure he'll speak more about that. So welcome, Michael.
Hello, everyone. Hi all. The speakers we divided it up between us, and I was pushed to focus on Brexit and the outcome. But with my other hat on, I will also talk a little bit about the legacy of Corbynism if I can. As similarly to I was on the Momentum steering committee when all of this democracy was shut down. So I've got Brexit and the legacy of Corbynism, which I think in many ways are the two great contexts in which we find ourselves, are the two great prevailing external forces. And I suppose that seems ironic in a way because Brexit is technically over, but of course it isn't over and never will be. In fact, I'm afraid as soon as Brexit happened, it was always going to dominate our politics for 10 or 20 years. That was the entire point of it, because really what Brexit is about is the entire structure of our economy and our society, and an imperial nostalgic version of that coupled with major deregulation. So we've just signed a deal, which the British government has just signed a deal, which essentially keeps tariff-free trade, but of course means that somebody's just saying sound quality poor. Is that the case for everyone?
It's okay, Michael. It's breaking up a little bit, but you're okay. We can understand you.
Okay. Yeah, it's a bit of a bugger. My internet ain't great. I'm going to try to see what I can do about making it a little bit better. Sorry, chaps. It looks like I'm talking from a 1980s videotape. Thanks, Simon. So look, the trade deal we just signed with Europe essentially means no tariffs. But every time the UK diverges, the EU will have the ability to respond with tariffs across the board. So what that will mean is a constant cycle by which that Britain is diverging from EU regulations, and in response, the EU is putting in tariffs, which in place lots of tariffs which cost lots of jobs. So we're going to face this constant nationalist, anti-EU baiting cycle, in which bad things constantly happen, and the UK government is going to constantly be able to blame it on the EU. And of course, by divergence, what we mean is deregulation. So 80% of our environmental legislation comes from the EU. Lots of limits on working hours, sick pay, all basically most rights for agency workers, all that sort of stuff comes from the EU. In fact, the UK was one of the few countries in Western Europe that whose labour standards were so low domestically that we relied on EU standards. And of course, all of that is now under threat. So too are things like food standards and so on, and human rights, which is a slightly different thing, will also come under more and more threat. We'll begin to see erosions of stuff like the European Convention of Human Rights, I would imagine, in the next few years. The tabloid press and the Tories have always been clear about their intentions in that regard. Now, the US trade deal is the mechanism by which they're going to deregulate, de-align us from Europe and realign us with a less regulated economy. Relatively straightforward. But there's also all kinds of other stuff that they're going to try to do. Free ports is one. So we're likely to see more and more sort of zones in Britain, towns that are either zero or low tax, or zero or low regulation, or therefore receive high investment. And basically what you're seeing is a race to the bottom, with the UK competing with other capitalist economies to drive down standards and therefore drive up investment in a way that it couldn't previously do. So that's broadly speaking the wonderful context. Which of course also throws up major constitutional questions in the UK. The debate around electoral reform is likely to become much bigger in the Labour movement, especially given the fact that we've just gone through an election where second referendum parties won a majority of the popular vote, but couldn't get in, obviously. But the main thing that's going to throw up is Scotland, and I don't think the English left has got its head around the extent to which Scotland is going to dominate, that constitutional crisis is going to dominate our politics, and the extent to which the English left is going to be responsible for a movement for self-determination, for supporting the movement for self-determination. So the left's response to all of this has been pretty dire so far across the board. We are incredibly hamstrung at the moment. I think we are essentially in the course of this pandemic, we are deciding on different shades of useless things to do: digital actions, petitions, writing to your MP, and so on. But we aren't really capable of creating much leverage for as long as this pandemic goes on. And that has been a huge problem happening, especially given the fact that the pandemic happened just after one of the greatest defeats of the left in recent years. Starmer's triangulation on things like freedom of movement, which he's abandoned, and his voting for the Brexit deal. I have to say, there are a number of people on the anti-Brexit left who were taken in by the idea that Starmer might be somehow left-wing on economic issues and slightly better on the internationalist questions because he was supposedly Mr. Remain. I have to say, I was never taken in by that, and I'm totally unsurprised by the fact that Starmer is essentially presenting the worst of both worlds. Basically, my criticism, and Europe's criticism of Corbyn during the years when he was in charge, and the triangulatory policy that he took on Brexit and freedom of movement at times, was essentially that Corbyn was behaving like an establishment Labour politician when it came to issues of Brexit and freedom of movement. So it doesn't surprise me at all that Starmer is presenting exactly that same front. There is a red wall mania in quite a sort of vulgar way, in the way that the left talks about these things. That includes the Labour leadership, but it bleeds into the way that the left is talking about Brexit and about whether or not it's willing to have an argument about Brexit or migrants' rights. And that includes places like Momentum as well. So we've got a real problem, a real uphill struggle in making sure, when trying to push issues of internationalism and free movement back onto the agenda. You know, the debate about whether or not the working class consists entirely of old white men with regional accents is going to be a major one in the coming years. So of course it would be fine for people to say, it would be fine for Starmer, and it would be fine for the mainstream Labour left to say Brexit is over if that was just a matter of rebranding. But of course it isn't. It's a harbinger of a material retreat on questions of migrants' rights and so on. So what can we do about this whole situation of Brexit in the meantime? Well, Another Europe has 3 strands to its strategy. One is to kill the worst bits of what the Tories are trying to do and run campaigns around those. We identified 2 pressure points there as the settled status regime, which is, there are 4 million, maybe 5 million EU nationals in the UK. Even with a 99% acceptance rate, you're still going to face tens of thousands of people being deported or facing deportation. So we've got a very big campaign to replace that with a statutory right to stay, which has so far been endorsed by all opposition parties except the Labour Party. The US trade deal is also potentially an area where we could push the government back with enough mobilisation and enough of a campaign, because it's so toxic in the red wall constituencies that the Tories are going to have to try to hang on to. And so if you can demonstrate enough opposition on stuff like workers' rights, you could probably force retreats out of the Tories in the next 5 years. The second strand is mass movements of resistance. And that's kind of what we need to do, is take the climate movement, take moments like BLM, I'm not saying BLM specifically, and turn them into political movements and make sure that they raise political demands that fit with the strategy to change post-Brexit Britain in a real and lasting way, rather than, as Simon's saying, come up like a rocket and down like a stick. And the third is making sure that when Labour gets into power, it reverses all of this stuff. And that does mean, and obviously pressure from outside is almost the main thing, but that does mean there will have to be a reckoning within the Labour Party and within the trade unions about all of this stuff, whether that's migrants' rights and so on. And it means that we need to have a debate amongst ourselves about what we want Britain's relationship with the EU to be. You know, and now we've left, are we going to campaign for rejoin? Are we going to campaign for a single market position? I think there's a real lively debate to be had there amongst ourselves, and it's important that we, at least in the next couple of years, have some clarity on what we're trying to achieve.
Thanks, Michael.
2 minutes, yeah. So I just want to say, which I'm going to have to blurt out, the legacy of Corbynism in 2 minutes. So I suppose, look, hundreds of thousands of people have been thrown into activity, many of them for the first time. And I think there's a temptation to say that Corbynism was this great movement that got things a bit wrong on Brexit. And I'm afraid I really don't think that's true. I think there was an awful lot more wrong with Corbynism. And all of these people have been taken on a massive, summarise this quickly, Labourist journey, right? Cheerleading, top-down politics, fixing, professionalisation, parliamentarism, electoralism, constant attempts to triangulate. Some of those people have taken that process to its logical conclusion, have moved to the right, and have become Starmerites. Some of those people have not done that and are effectively part of a continuity leadership loyal cult of Jeremy Corbyn and other senior Labour Party politicians, but kind of after the leadership is over. The good news is that most people haven't done either of those things. That's good and bad, because it's good because these people were the instinctively internationalist, instinctively left-wing people who Another Europe was supported by, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call regard themselves as part of. It's bad because unless those people get pulled into something, they are going to evaporate. Social movements and trade unionism are at historic lows, but something needs to capture the zeitgeist and scoop up that huge number of people left behind by the death of Corbynism. That needs to focus on real agency from below, a sense of militancy, and most importantly, a sense of critical thinking. Because and currently on the left, nothing exists that can do that. And so I therefore hope that ACR will begin to create a space on the left that can begin to do that. Because if it's not, we're going to be left with the Corbyn project, and essentially being left on a left-wing version of 38 degrees. And it really is, I think, the case for me, like the bit of the left that I'm from, which is, I think, the same bit of the left that the ACR is trying to cover. That's why I'm considering joining. But the actually has had no organisation within the Corbyn project, no organisation, no proper factional life. And unless we get our act together, all of the remnants of Corbynism are either going to evaporate or get scooped up by a continuity leadership cult. I'll leave you on that rosy thought. Apologies, I didn't time myself very well, so I ran out, but I'll stick around for the discussion.
Thanks, Michael. A lot to consider there. So I'm going to turn to questions from the floor. Okay. If you can find your blue hand, try and put that up. I'm going to take the first question from Jamie Anker. You've got 2 minutes.
Hello again.
3 minutes.
And a really interesting discussion at points you just raised. And I guess the question I'd be interested in is, given the historical context of what happens to left-wing political parties when they get too involved with the capitalist status quo political system, is that, look at what happened to the SPD in Germany, and look at the question Rosa Luxemburg had to deal with back in a very, I look back at history and the issues that Rosa Luxemburg had to deal with the SPD, and I just think, given the calamity, it begs the question of, you need to do as much as you can do, and given that, you must build, given with that point, I guess it is the case, you must build outside of Labour. Whether or not that's building outside of Labour in the political sphere or outside of it, I think they're both different questions. But regarding that historical context I mentioned, of given how left-wing parties can get too encroached with the status quo, that leads them to reformism or the issues, I guess the point of my question is, given historical context of similar situations of left-wing parties becoming more reformist rather than what they should be revolutionary, do you think we should definitely look at building political forces around the Labour Party as well, considering the severity of the situation we're in? Is that clear?
Yes, thanks, Jamie. Okay, so the blue hand, if you go down to participants, you will see at the bottom of that raise hand. If you can do that, I can see it, because otherwise I won't be able to see you on the screen. Sagar Sumaria.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Black Lives Matter was mentioned, and also climate change. So with me, whatever the race and skin color that I have, any movement that I decide to follow, I like to always see, and I always like to follow the money, because I need to see the authenticity of that movement, especially if it's for my skin color and my race, being from India. And so I remember a few weeks ago, I saw no support from BLM for the Sikh people in London campaigning against the Indian government incursions on the Indian farmers. So my 2 questions are, firstly on climate change, that I've seen no outright support from BLM when it comes to the, there's a lot of talk on climate change and solutions and everything. I've seen no support from BLM against the incursions against the farmers, against the mineral theft for renewables, which have been taken from India for lithium for renewables. And also when I'm looking at influencewatch.org, I've seen since 2013, $133 million in donations from many big organizations for BLM. That's not a grassroots movement. How can that be a genuine movement? And have they not taken and underseated money from real, genuine grassroots organizations campaigning for race and climate change issues? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sagar. Terry Conway.
Thanks, Joseph. I wanted to pick up on what Seema said, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. I think I would have differences with what you said about, not about the principle of internationalism, but about how to organize that, the organizational consequences of that, because it seems to me that it's certainly true that the role of the nation state is different than it was even 10 years ago in lots of different senses. I think for people in Britain today, it's probably the whole question of the disunited kingdom, the demands in Scotland for the huge support for the independence movement in Scotland, the increasing support in Wales for independence, as something that people on the English, not to mention the question of whether there's going to be a new border poll in Ireland, is something we need to take into account. I think we also need to take into account that culturally and politically, many groups of migrants in this country also look to the politics of the countries from which, or the regions from which they or their families migrated, not in the sense that they're not engaged with British politics, but that they might be following what's happening to the farmers in India or the workers in the Philippines or wherever it is. And I think the British left is very bad at taking that into account. But I don't think from that point of view, we in England, which is where we predominantly are, can have the arrogance to think we know best about what farmers in India are actually struggling for, or what workers are. So I think it's about building horizontal links rather than trying to do it from the top. And then I thought just two sentences about my experience of horizontal organising during the pandemic, which nobody's talked about. My concentration since March has been on building mutual aid around the slogan of solidarity, not charity. I've lived in the community I live in now for more than 25 years, and I've got to know more people in my neighbourhood since March than in the whole of those 25 years put together. I've got to know the texture of different migrant organisations, different...
Can you wind up now, Terry, please?
Who have their own structure, and the history of mutual aid, which goes back to the Black Power movement in the States, which goes back to women's organisations in Latin America, is something that we as revolutionaries in this country need to learn from.
Thanks, Terry. Richard Farnos. You are muted.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, I thought Seema's contribution was very good and useful and powerful. I also think the problem with much of the left is not just the fact that it doesn't really tackle racism, but also other so-called identity politics. In fact, I find the term identity politics really problematic, because it implies that we're talking about some sort of theoretical notion that is invented by a lecturer in some polytechnic somewhere. It is not. It is about people's real lived lives and their struggles to get access to services and to get access, you know, to be considered an equal, to get civil rights and what have you. And so the left often, and it's even the revolutionary left, often gets into this thing of talking about class politics, as if being gay and working class isn't class politics. And this is part of the problem that we need if we really are going to move on, because quite frankly, young people won't put up with this. It is that if we need to move on, we need to grasp these issues in a much more structured and integrated way. Namely, too often the left-wing organisations stick black politics, stick gay politics, stick women's politics as a sort of add-on onto the central core of activity. Now that's just not good enough. You know, we are the majority. You know, white working class or men are the minority. You know, so you know it needs to be recognised that. And the other thing I thought was very useful is about the need to be less hierarchical. You know, I must admit, when we have this discussion tomorrow about the Constitution, I find, you know, we need to move away from a very hierarchical Constitution, and that is even at the top as such. Namely, our national organisation that steers the organisation needs to be much more responsive and take involvement of other people from the periphery. Namely, that these sort of national committees or steering groups need to steer as opposed to necessarily lay down the law and everybody sort of follows it. I mean, you know, you know what Michael has said, so it shows where that leads us. But you know, we need to make sure that we have structures and where people who might not have the time to be able to commit to being on some sort of national committee permanently can be involved in developing bits of work and campaigns for the organisation.
Right, thank you, Richard. Patrick Scott.
Okay, thanks. I completely agreed with what Seema said about the need for internationalism and international solidarity, and I think that what really undid the Corbynista movement was that many people who saw themselves as Corbynistas, and I'm talking about people, for example, in my CLP in Islington South, they tended to view international issues as secondary to the national issues. And I think this was shown with Corbyn himself, the way he appeased the right on the question of the so-called anti-Semitism controversy, and I think it was disgraceful in many respects some of the things that he did or allowed to happen. For example, the expulsion of Jackie Walker from the Labour Party. I mean, he just stood by and let that happen. And Jackie Walker was a woman with an exemplary record of fighting racism and supporting internationalism. And more generally on the discussion around the Labour Party, and also we'll discuss that in more detail tomorrow. But my general observation is, which I think should be self-evident, is that nobody under 30 today is going to be attracted to Keir Starmer's Labour Party, unless, of course, they happen to be dyed-in-the-wool Social Democrats, which means you can effectively write them off politically. And people are joining the Labour Party now because Keir Starmer is the leader, because he is the, so to speak, the anti-Corbyn. And many of the people who joined on the whole wake of Corbynism, on the whole some wave of Corbynism, they're starting to leave the Labour Party. So that suggests to me the whole centre of gravity in terms of how we do build ourselves as the ACR is going to be more and more focused outside the Labour Party while Starmer remains leader. And if Starmer falls as leader, unfortunately, I think it could be someone even further to the right than he is. That doesn't mean everyone's got to leave the Labour Party tomorrow. I've still got a Labour Party membership card on. I'm just about hanging on it. But I mean, I think people have to sort of think about an exit strategy from the Labour Party in the short to medium term. It's just on the question of a national organisation. Obviously, we have to. What Seema said about the nation state was right. I mean, but I think organising around a nation state is something that's forced upon us. We organise within a nation state because we're confronting the nation state, or we're confronting the state in which we are as an entity that has to be smashed by revolutionary means. We organise within the state in order to fight it, in order to destroy it, which obviously distinguishes ourselves from social democrats, especially in the imperialist countries. Well, so they organise within the state in order to identify with it, in order to get meagre reforms within, and in order to align themselves ultimately with the ruling class within that state. Okay, I'm finished.
Thanks, Patrick. Simon Francis.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to ask something on unions. There's been considerable recruitment to trade unions in the past year. I'm also thinking about the classic example of the huge NEU Zoom conference recently, before they refused to go into work. But there's also been momentum outside the orbit of those more traditional unions and or TUC affiliated unions, particularly in areas of the so-called gig economy. Now I'm a member of the TEFL Workers Union, people who teach English as a foreign language, for example. Now that's part of the industrial workers of the world. And that has also grown like the clappers in the past year, and we've had some successes in the past year as well. So I was just wondering, how does the ACR plan to relate to that development? Cheers.
Thanks, Simon. A very good question, I think. Ian Parker. Ian?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So really, thanks for those three great speakers just now. And thanks to Seema for reminding us about the intimate link between internationalism and the diversity of the working class here in this country. I think we really need to hammer away at this idea that there is a red wall and that there's a certain kind of idealized version of the working class that we must tailor our policies to, so that we fall into the trap of nationalism and homophobia and all kinds of other things because we think that that's what this working class wants. I think Seema is absolutely right to raise that question about the mythical working class. And I think we need to emphasize, as we form ourselves as an organization, that as revolutionary Marxists, our internationalism is an intimate part of what we are in our solidarity with other parts of the world and what we are here inside this country. We have to be internationalist here in our activities as well. And we have to emphasize that we are revolutionary Marxists. This is going to be a different kind of project, and we're going to be having to think about how we engage with other organizations as well. How we engage with the other sectarian left organizations, of course, but also in time, and this is a question that was raised both by Michael and by Simon, we have to think about how some of us carry on working inside the Labour Party. And yes, it's awful. I was eating, banging my head against the wall on Thursday evening. It's very, very painful. But some of us are still working inside the Labour Party, and we need to think about supporting those comrades as members of ACR. Some of us will be working inside Left Unity, which is a quite different project. Left Unity is not a revolutionary Marxist project, but it complements in some way what we're doing. So we need to work with those comrades and inside Left Unity as well. Some of our comrades as ACR members, maybe inside the Green Party. And of course, for some of us, we have a very strong allegiance to the Fourth International as an organization of revolutionary Marxists, which brings together comrades from around the world and shares experience. So we have a task of internationalism in our politics and in our forms of organization and in the way that we mobilize inside other organizations that are in some ways hostile to us. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Daniel Jeffrey.
Sorry, yeah, I'm going to leave my camera off just because my internet is very poor. So let me know if it cuts out completely. Obviously, I'll stop. But yeah, there's loads of fascinating topics that people have brought up. Anything from the climate crisis to BLM to internationalism. But I just wanted to comment briefly on what people are saying about the Labour Party, because I think where the left has to be careful is using a lot of kind of formal theories, but then that not getting anywhere in reality. Because if you look at what happened under Corbyn, when people talk about kind of engaging with communities and wider projects like that, what actually happened in under Corbyn in CLPs? Because there was hardly any engagement in local activism in terms of community struggles. Strikes remained at an historical low throughout the Corbyn project when he was leader. And almost all of the energy was put into kind of internal faction fighting, getting people voted onto committees, getting CLPs over to the left. I mean, sadly, we didn't even manage to deselect hardly any of the MPs. As far as I know, not a single MP was actually deselected. But mainly I'm talking about work outside of the Labour Party, and Momentum started saying that it would be a organisation that looked into the Labour Party but also took up struggles outside the Labour Party. At the very beginning, it even said it would accept members who weren't in the Labour Party. That all went out of the window, and Momentum, again, just followed an entirely inward-looking electoral project. And I'm just thinking, well, if we didn't manage to get things like direct action, because again, Extension Rebellion, which was a big thing, in reality, how many CLPs actively turned people out for the Extinction Rebellion direct action on the bridges and stuff like that? And I mean, I think it was hardly anyone. So if none of that came about under Corbyn, what does it actually mean now to when people say we need to engage with the tens of thousands of socialists in the Labour Party? Because there may be tens of thousands of socialists in the Labour Party of one stripe or another, but how do you actually engage them? Because Momentum is still carrying on as a very inward-looking organisation. I still don't see anything being organised in a kind of movementist sense outside of the Labour Party. And I just think that our energy needs to be put into building like practical struggles. And I'm still in the Labour Party, and I'm not necessarily saying people should leave. But what I don't want is people spent a huge amount of energy in the last 5 years, and I can't really see the results from it. The Labour left is practically as weak now as it was before Corbyn in terms of the Socialist Campaign Group. And I think personally, I would rather do something that infused me and brought, positive energy. There's so much negativity and infighting in the Labour Party. And I just think we should look outside of the Labour Party, look at movements like Black Lives Matter, look at the climate change movements, look at how we can try and at least start to begin to transform the trade unions into some kind of fighting bodies. Even if it's acts of taking small direct action, coordinating that around the country, it might enthuse more younger people to get involved and not just the usual suspects. But yeah, that's my point. I just think I do worry about any strategy in Labour. If it didn't work under Corbyn, I just think we might be smashing our heads against the wall, and I'd rather people spend their energy in more positive projects.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to bring in Dave Hill.
Yeah, hello, comrades. I'm really pleased that this event is taking place, and I've been a member on and off of Socialist Resistance for since about 2005, although I've been a Marxist for many decades. So I'm really pleased about this renewal, this regroupment. I think all parties need to have an influx new perspectives. I mean, I don't necessarily mean different perspectives, but new perspectives on the perspectives, and also different age group. I was quite shocked when I went to my first SR meeting that I was then the youngest person in the room, just about. Mind you, this was about 20 years ago, and I have aged since. So I welcome very much, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading stuff like Neil Faulkner has been writing, and the contributions today. I want to make a few points. I was in the Labour Party for over 40, a total of about 45, 46 years. Parliamentary candidate, Labour group leader, trade union, etc., trades council, blah, blah, blah. I think it's pointless. I'm not going to, the big chance was Corbynism. The big chance, the best chance since what, Attlee or since Keir Hardie, whatever. It failed. And the speed and determination and vitriol and success with which the Starmer and the right wing of the Labour Party are getting rid of the left is something to be seen and believed. We know it. Most of us know it. Been active in the Labour Party. I only left a couple of months ago for the second time. Much more aggressive than expelling the few militants they expelled in the 1980s. There's no chance. And I'm in touch. My local branch, which I left, very left-wing branch, the most left-wing in one of the most left-wing constituencies in the country, Brighton Pavilion. But even there, a few days ago, we had a branch meeting. I'm not in the branch anymore, but we meet up, socialists outside the Labour Party and socialists inside the Labour Party. We meet up virtually and physically when it's permitted physically. Even there, a vote to censure Starmer was defeated, and people who have voted solid left for a long time were saying, oh, well, we don't want to get the branch suspended or the constituency. So the point of this is, I really don't think it's worth spending our time inside the Labour Party. But now I'm going to contradict myself. There's a dialectic here. That there are very good comrades, of course, who are still hanging in there, fighting for council seats, fighting to dominate on the local general committee of the Labour Party. And it is, as many people say, Labour Party is a site of struggle. And if we can get people into elected positions, then tribunes of the people use those positions, classic. Social democracy ain't going to get us into a revolutionary situation or revolutionary Marxism.
Okay.
The final point, very briefly then, if I'm running out of time. Yeah, okay. It's important to build the parallel structures. I happen to be in Labour Left Alliance. I'm not recruiting for it. 2,000 plus supporters. I'm not in Left Unity, though I was. I think, and Corbyn's minimalist, social democratic, hierarchical project, Peace and Progress and Apple Pie. That's yet another way of organising for a break which will surely happen. And so, yes, it's about making relationships with different organisations, as well, of course, as with different people.
Okay. I'm going to bring in Chris Jones in a minute, but just before I do that, I'm very aware of the fact that we've had only one woman comrade speak in this discussion. So if there are any women comrades who would like to take part now, please do so. So I'm bringing in Chris Jones.
Hi. I'll be very brief because Ian Parker said that the bulk of what I was thinking of saying, in terms of the internationalism and indeed revolutionary Marxism. So I suppose the main contribution I've got to make at the moment is to emphasize that we need to be taking out the ideas of revolutionary Marxism into all the struggles that are going on. You know, whether that be your trade union, your Labour Party, your tenants campaign, or whatever it might be. We have to be clear of our identity and our overall objective, and that is actually to win people to an understanding that, you know, capitalism isn't going to fade away. It's going to go, and it's going to require, and it's way beyond.
I think your connection is breaking down, Chris.
A lot of what people have been talking about, in so much. The key of what we're here for, much as we want to be great activists in all the campaigns that are going on, is we've got something larger and bigger and longer. So we're not just socialists. For me, we're revolutionary eco-socialists, and we need to be winning people to the social changes, economic changes that are necessary to achieve those objectives.
All right, thank you, Chris. Okay, in the absence of any other contributions, I'm moving back to the panel now for some final comments. So Seema, coming first to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for those contributions. Sagar, I thought your contribution was actually really important. And I think this point about the Indian farmers and how should the ACR and the left generally respond. I would say that if you're creating an internationalist organization, you would and should reach out to Indian Marxists and Indian revolutionary Marxists from the outset. And you should have like an organizing meeting where they're present and where they're leading. And you say, what can we learn from you? Because to be honest with you, I think there's a huge amount that activists here can learn from Marxists in India, where they've had like a huge general strike, and where, and also about the links between Indian labor and exploitation and the British economy. There are lots of links. And I think building those links organically in terms of organizing meetings and activism can then lead to very positive, concrete, effective actions that can sort of link these, like the supply chains of labor and linking consumers of products that are made in India with the workers who create those products, and linking their struggles and putting pressure on, say, companies, factories and governments. Okay, I'm not just talking about Indian farmers, but I'm talking more broadly now about fighting for genuine struggles like wage struggles, things like that. So I think, again, an internationalist organizing structure can help in that sense. In terms of the question of nationalism, I think I saw someone posting about how during the first international, national Marxist parties were created, and that's how the organizing worked. I think that there's a lesson to be learned from that, because as soon as the First World War came along, all those national Marxist parties capitulated and joined with the national bourgeoisie and supported their national bourgeoisie on whatever side of the war they were on. So I think actually having a structure that's more internationalist and operates in a more internationalist way can militate against nationalist implosions in that way. But obviously nobody's created the perfect Marxist organization, because if they had, we wouldn't be in capitalism right now. And I think the experience of the different national left movements in South America, for instance, winning political power in their respective nations only to be toppled by coups led by America, shows that without an internationalist organization, the left winning nationally doesn't result in socialism. So we do have to be ambitious and create an international structure. The point about the nation state as well, and how we need to organize against and resist the nation state, I think we're sort of forgetting that actually the power of the nation state and the idea that power is concentrated in the nation state is an illusion. It's actually concentrated in international capital. For instance, where did Farage's funding come from? Where did the whole Brexit campaign come from? Where did the advertising money for all these Facebook ads that are pushing people towards the far right come from? It didn't come from national capital, it came from international capital. And there was a lot of funding coming from the United States and things like the Heritage Foundation channeled that way. So we need to see our enemy. It's not the nation state, it's this international capital. further, the fascists who are sort of organising on WhatsApp groups and Signal and online forums, they're all organising internationally. There was this guy a few years back who we talked about as a case study in Creeping Fascism from Italy, who decided to go on a murdering spree of migrants, and he was radicalised on a WhatsApp or on an online forum like 4chan or something. And this is like how they're organising internationally already, with the funding of international capital. So we have to respond like for like, organising internationally to defeat the rise of fascism and to build socialism.
Thank you, Seema. Michael, I'm going to bring you in now to respond to some of the questions and issues raised.
Yeah, obviously you don't have time to respond to it all. I suppose I'll just take 3 issues. I suppose one is the issue of internationalism and international solidarity. And I think what Seema was saying was very helpful, because I think one of the things that the internationalist left is bad at dealing with is that we don't, essentially what we can't do when we talk about internationalism is just organise a load of Zoom events about foreign countries. Because, and I think that this is something that which sounds incredibly simple, but which really a lot of the internationalist left and hasn't really got to grips with, and I think another Europe's guilty of it as well, which is, what does meaningful solidarity mean, you know? Like, so there's a great Frankie Boyle, an interview with Frankie Boyle, who is way more kind of like thoughtful and lefty than you'd think he was from some of his material, but says, well, basically, like, we've got to a point where solidarity kind of just means best wishes, but for left-wing people. And there is really, if that is our version of solidarity, then there's a reason why we're losing the argument over international solidarity. You know, are we sending money to Solidarność? Are we doing collections for the miners? You know, what is the real solidarity that we're doing here? How is it meaningful? And I think that's something that we need to constantly challenge ourselves, rather than just say, oh, you know, it's important what happens in other countries, isn't it? Because I think that is how we come across quite a lot of the time, sort of doing worthy things. Second point was on identity politics, where obviously I completely agree with what Richard said, which was kind of about, you know, we need to shatter the idea of class politics being opposed to identity politics in that sense, and we need to kind of fight the idea of well, you know, fight the conception of the working class that at various points the Labour right, the militant tendency, and the Communist Party have proclaimed, which is reactionary white blokes in manual grades, and in manual, like in like heavy industry jobs, right? And I guess like but I think in a way what we've got to do is slightly harder than that, because at the same time as fighting that you know, that vulgar quote unquote class politics, we also have to identify our own version of liberation politics, because actually there is a lot of crap liberal identity politics out there at the moment. You know, ultra perspectivism, you know, very liberal feminism, very liberal takes on liberation, which, you know, having been in the student movement, I'm now 31, but, you know, I spent a long time in the student movement in my 20s, and having watched some of that stuff play out, we definitely need our own independent Marxist, socialist and feminist politics, and you know, LGBT liberation politics and black liberation politics. That is our own, and we develop that independently. And finally, I just wanted to talk about the Labour Party, because I think we're in a genuine quandary, in that, you know, one side of this debate says, what is your alternative? Unless you have proportional representation, there is no alternative. Every single electoral alternative to the Labour Party outside the proportional representation is dead, and has always been dead, and will never come back to life, not until there's proportional representation. And the other side of the argument says the Labour left strategy has clearly failed. I mean, Corbynism was obviously it. Like, if it was ever going to break through, that was it. and it sucks the life out of all of the stuff we're trying to achieve. It teaches everyone the wrong lessons about wheeler-dealerism, fixer politics, top-down politics, electoralism, and it's not just a dead end; it's also poisonous. And the problem is that they're both right, and I think that this is not, and that is not a, and I can understand why so many people, of the generations older than me must feel like they're stuck in a lift, because I'm reading a transcript at the moment of the debate of the decade, which was a debate held in the Albert Hall, chaired by Peter Hain, with Tony Benn on one side and Hilary Wainwright and Paul Foot and co on the other, talking about the arguing out between the Labour left and the extra parliamentary left. And essentially, you could replace the events that they refer to and their names with current figures, and the debate hasn't changed at all since the debate of the decade, as far as I can work out. The debate of in or out of the Labour Party. I thought in that debate, I think, I say two things. Firstly, if we ever want to work past that, then actually all of a sudden the question of proportional representation stops being a technocratic issue and starts becoming a key strategic one for the left, especially for the revolutionary left, because then actually we could break through with another vehicle and there might be an alternative to the Labour Party. But the other thing that struck me about that was I thought by far and away the most convincing speech was one from Hilary Wainwright, who was on the extra parliamentary side, but she was the only person who wasn't there representing a group, though she had been in the ING briefly. What she concludes by talking about needing to find a way of doing politics in which we are neither spectators nor vanguards. And I think that really succinctly captures for me that need to find a way through that dichotomy, in which both of the critique of the extra parliamentary left and the critique of the Labour Party left are both right, and we're going to have to find a way through it. And for me, I think the politics of the sect and the politics of the Labour left have both conclusively failed, and we need projects that try to be neither of them. And that is kind of what ACR is. So I'll leave you on that note and say I think it's very important that ACR succeeds.
Thank you, Michael, for those very encouraging words. And finally, last but not least, to Simon.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you to all the speakers and everyone that contributed in the discussion as well. Obviously, there's lots still needs to be said, and I think it's important to emphasise to comrades that this is the beginning of the ACR. We are trying to focus on a few key things now and places where we can agree. And so there's lots of things we haven't even really kind of touched upon yet. I mean, the ACR is not a finished organisation. We're not, a political party which has positions on, like everything under the sun. So we are starting from the position we're in now. We're trying to build up the organisation, build up the analysis, build up the arguments and the policies, and we need to get that right. And obviously, it's important for the ACR going forward that we, try and consolidate as much as we can around what we agree on. But we don't have the luxury of time. And I think a lot of the discussions so far today have pointed to the urgency of the situation, around especially the growth of the far right, the threat that they pose, and also, 2030 is, when the UN scientists are saying that's kind of the tipping point in terms of runaway climate change, if not sooner. So kind of the clock is ticking. It's important to have these discussions, but also be able to build an organisation, as comrades have said, that can actually intervene and actually try and make a difference. So this is kind of the first step on that way. Just on some of the points that were raised in the meeting. I mean, just on Corbynism, I think that the issue is that the era of Jeremy Corbyn being leader didn't resolve any of the fundamental contradictions within the Labour Party or the Labour movement. The PLP is still dominated by the right. Most Labour councillors are on the right of the party. It didn't make the party particularly more democratic. It didn't resolve any of the undemocratic issues of the relationship between Labour and the trade unions. It didn't help build anything in the trade unions to kind of challenge the bureaucracies or kind of try and help build left organisations. And now it's gone. I know there's comrades that are still fighting the good fight and trying to piece together what they can from it, but I mean, I temperamentally agree with the other comrades that sort of that was the best shot that we had. Certainly we're not going to get another shot like that this side of 2030. And so we have to step back, evaluate, draw up a balance sheet and try and think, how we can kind of go forward. On the trade unions, which I didn't mention in the introduction, but was mentioned in the discussion. I mean, I'm a branch secretary in Unison. We just had the best vote for a left candidate, Paul Holmes, that we've ever had since the union was founded in 1993. Didn't win, but as I said, got a very credible vote. And now, unfortunately, the left in Unison is split three ways and will probably be standing candidates against each other in the NEC elections. So the lessons that the left have drawn in Unison are not very positive, and we're potentially facing the problem that the right wing could seize control of Unite at the next General Secretary election later in the year. And certainly there's all kinds of potential scandals brewing within Unite. So the trade union movement, in that sense, I think we need to have some very serious discussions about it. We do have a trade union group. So if comrades are in a trade union, please get in touch because we need to try and organise left-wing trade unionists better. We need to try and have a strategy for the unions, because what the left is doing so far isn't really working. And even when the left does, quote unquote, take control of a union, it doesn't necessarily make that much difference, because the anti-union laws prevent any serious action from being taken around things like political issues or, I mean, even like a generalised strike now across the whole of the country will be very hard to pull off with the anti-union laws the way they are. So I'm not saying that as a way of kind of being defeatist, but we have to be realistic about the British trade unions, or the trade unions in Britain, and we need to think about how we can, move forward and like try and untangle some of those knots. Just on the issue around Brexit, because obviously that will dominate in many ways the next however many years. And there's an amendment which I've drafted going to the conference tomorrow. It is clear that Brexit is a project by the right to deregulate the economy, as Michael and other comrades outlined. It is being pushed by people who are kind of Thatcherites on steroids. They see this as an opportunity, not just to kind of re-establish British sovereignty, whatever that means, but to, finish what Thatcher started. And certainly, that's the project, and that's why it's driven by disaster capitalists and, people who are also fundamentally very undemocratic. So the battles over the consequences of Brexit will dominate over the next few years. And I think from the ACR's perspective, we are made up of people who, largely speaking, not all of us, but largely speaking, opposed Brexit, not because we love the EU. We're very critical of the EU and its neoliberal nature, its anti-migrant policies and so on. But I think that we assessed that the balance of forces in terms of Brexit at that time was not being driven by the left and could not be driven by the left. And indeed, the consequences of Brexit would be reactionary. And unfortunately, that's been borne out. But for the ACR going forward, of course, we will work with comrades. They might have had a different position on Brexit, or they, might not have supported some of the campaigns that some of us were involved in the past. But we want to unite with people to fight around the struggles that are coming up. So if people want to fight around stopping deregulation, stopping privatisation, defending workers' rights, of course, we will be working with those people. We're not going to be sectarian about it. The final thing I want to say very quickly, which kind of links in with the whole issue around kind of class that people were talking about. One of the things the ACR has to contribute in a very positive way around is this discussion around class. And I obviously totally agree with the comments that Richard and Seema and other comrades made about the importance of the right for the oppressed groups to self-organise, the right for people who are from oppressed groups to, be able to put forward their politics, their kind of positions, things that they want to fight around. We have to be very, very clear, because there is a tendency that is growing on the left, as well as on the right, to try and make out that the working class is like a blood type, and it is essentially the white working class. and the white working class is economically protectionist and socially conservative. And there's books being written to try and like reinforce this position. Of course, it comes from, you know, UKIP, it comes from voices within the Tory party, it comes from the mainstream media, you know, kind of the liberal left are all middle class Guardian readers, and kind of the solid working class, salt of the earth types are all kind of quasi-fascistic blue collar workers. And this is a narrative, this is an ideology, this is something that's being put out to try and divide the working class. And is also a clearly anti-socialist argument. Unfortunately, there's some people on the left who kind of go along with it. And we have to be very clear that we absolutely oppose that conception of the working class. The working class at its best, when it's political, when it's organized, when it's fighting for its genuine interests, not fake interests which are infused with nationalism. The working class is internationalist. The working class is anti-racist. The working class is multicultural. It is, you know, it's made up of everyone who is, you know, who is forced to sell their labour under capitalism. And that view of the working class is a kind of a positive force for social change. That is what we have to, you know, fight to reintroduce and fight to make that the central point. Not to say that sort of, you know, struggles of the oppressed, you know, women or like the LGBT movement are secondary. Of course they're not. That is all part of it. And as Richard said, that is also part of the working class fight, because a lot of women are working class, a lot of LGBT people are working class, and their class arguments always come to the fore as the struggle becomes more intense. You can see that around the demands of women that are being raised in Poland. You know, kind of working class women are forced to come to the fore. It's often them that suffer the most from these reactionary policies. So I think that has to be a crucial part of the politics that we're fighting for in Britain and also internationally. We'll just say very quickly on the point around internationalism, I agree that it has to be practical. And it has to be as much as possible, not just sort of talking about something that's happening in another country, although that is important. I would say that my experience of being on the Labour left, it is hopelessly parochial. You know, there was very little discussion about international questions while on the Labour left. So I think we have to be kind of practical internationalists and see what that means in terms of the actual political work that we're doing. I agree, sort of, obviously, you know, like I agree with Seema's criticism of the nation state, but the nation state does currently still exist, and indeed Brexit and Trump and kind of movements like that are an attempt to reassert the dominance of the nation state over the forces of globalization, but it's being pushed by the right. It's being pushed by reactionary forces. So I think we have to sort of be very clear that we're opposed to these things. We are genuine internationalists. We are genuine anti-racist. We support migrants. We support people, you know, being able to live the lives that they want to live under capitalism. We will side with anyone who is struggling and fighting for their democratic rights. But of course, the question is of turning the fight for democratic rights into a fight against capitalism and a fight for socialism, because people will be fighting for their democratic rights, you know, until climate change does away with all of us. We need to get rid of capitalism. We need to mount that anti-capitalist challenge if we're going to really, really, really be able to resolve these fundamental problems facing humanity.
Thank you, Simon. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming today for what's been a very comradely and constructive debate. There was a very positive comment there in the chat from Daniel. He was suggesting that maybe if some of our speakers today got involved with the ACR, that'd be very productive. So just throwing that out there for you, Michael, as you said, you might possibly join. So just to remind people that tomorrow's event will be discussing where we go from here, our practical decisions on our constitution, on our statements, on our policies, and so on. And it's only open to members, I'm afraid. So if you want to come along tomorrow, you will need to become a member. So I'd just like to thank everyone again for taking part today and wishing you all success for the future.